on taxes that has been done in any jurisdiction in Canada. So it's a bold report. It did do what I asked of it in the terms of reference, but it has some challenging things, and that's why I said in the speech earlier that we have a lot to look at and study further. So premature at the moment to be engaging with any of the other sectors. And I would mention it's not just power generation. There are other sectors that would be particularly any manufacturing sector. And how about transportation sector, where they're moving goods and transporting goods across the province? That would have an impact. So I'm only naming a couple, but it would have to be something where we look at it sectorally and get a much better idea about the impacts and even who's here in the province that would have a particular interest. So we need to do a lot of homework to get ready to have any further discussions.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being it's not something I think about very often, and 10 being something that prevents me from sleeping, on that scale of 1 to 10, how concerned are you about an increase in interest rates in terms of what it does to the province?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Yeah, thank you very much, Madam Chair. And the question was well phrased. On a scale of 1 to 10, how much do not only myself, but maybe our deputy and senior officials, how much do we lose sleep over this? And number one is it's very well managed in our province. We have a large debt, and I've talked quite a bit tonight about it being at $15 billion now, but we're really, really well served by the staff and the executives that we have that work in that department and manage our debts. So one point that's of interest is we have very little floating rate debt. So we're not exposed on that day-to-day fluctuations and on that side. We're very controlled. That's good because it means we wouldn't see immediate impacts if there was a sudden spike in interest rates. On the other hand, we know that interest rates are historically low. I don't think any of us would ever imagine that we'd be in a time when they're that low for buying a house, mortgaging your home. Even though the Bank of Canada director, I forget what we call him exactly, but the person, what's his governor? Thank you, the governor of the Bank of Canada, who tries to use the interest rate to stimulate the economy. He's got it as low as you can go. Really, we're down to almost zero. So it's really a time when the risk is all for it to go up. And that is a concern. But again, I mentioned how well managed we are. One thing we've been doing, and I have a few success stories which I think are worth noting, but we've been trying to take our debt and extend it to longer, lock it in for longer periods of time at these low rates that we've got right now, and the opportunity is there. So I wanted to just mention a couple of them. I think you would find it interesting, Madam Chair, and the members opposite. About protecting against the rising interest rates, I have a couple of notes. We've issued more than $2 billion of 50-year and 30-year bonds since January 2012. So that's $2 billion out in 30 and 50-year bonds. Half of the outstanding market debt, that's bonds owed by investors, is now locked in for 15 years or longer. We have also controlled short-term and other debt that resets with interest rate changes. So that's another thing. During the past fiscal year, we issued about $1.1 billion of long-term debt for terms up to 30 years. So again, that long-term view, trying to ensure that as things come due, we're locking them in, because we're refinancing a lot of our debt all the time, that we're locking it in. It says here we save $15 million in 14-15 gross debt servicing costs because interest rates were lower than we expected a year ago, and because the financial fiscal situation had improved. And again, as we keep our province in a good fiscal, getting our fiscal house in order, maintaining our control over spending, all of that reflects in our bond ratings, and they have been stable. Last year's budget, even with the large deficit, we didn't get any change in our bond ratings. They stayed stable, and that helps to protect us as well from the upside, because if they changed our bond rating, our debt would become less reliable and our costs would go up. So that's another reason to be really careful on the control of spending and sending all the right signals to the financial markets that we are a province that is taking good care of its financial resources.
Time has elapsed for the PC caucus. We'll now move on to the NDP with the Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and it's nice to be able to rise to my feet again after my first 4.5 minutes. Again, I just want to thank the Finance Minister for answering all our questions here today, and I know it's a little tiring, but obviously there are many questions that we have specifically this particular year because of a lot of the actions that the government have taken and decisions that they've made, which are controversial to say the least, and which many of us are very concerned about. I do want to ask her, I know that she mentioned that that the government is carefully they want to create a fiscally conscious province. And I know that our government did try to do the same thing, which is why our whole theme was back to balance, and which is why the then first finance minister went all around the province, as I said, and did the very first back to balance tour ever. And we found out a lot of things, and it was interesting going to attending those meetings because, of course, everybody's a finance critic. It's like, everybody's an armchair director or everybody's an armchair politician. Everybody has their ideas about what you should do. But one of the things that I thought that Mr. Steele did at the time was to develop a thing online where you could balance the budget yourself and see where you would save money. And the whole idea was, well, if you're going to give money here, well, where are you going to cut? And I think a lot of people who did that exercise found out that it's not as easy as one would think it is. And there are many industries that are affected by small things. So, for instance, when on one particular day, the Premier found out that one of the biggest pulp and paper mills of the province was closing, or was going to be closing, he was faced with a terrible decision. It was also the same day that he found out, just half an hour before, that our federal leader, Jack Layton, had died. And so not only did he have to deal with the grief and shock of that, but half an hour or 40 minutes later, he had to go on in front of cameras and deal with the situation of one of the biggest pulp mills closing. It's not easy. Then shortly after that, we found out another one was closing. So what do? Do you save those jobs? Do you save 1,200 jobs? Or do you say, well, let it close? The pulp and paper mills, well, the pulp and paper industry is dying. It's a dying industry, just let it go. What do? It's very easy for armchair directors and armchair politicians to sit at home and say, oh, well, that was a terrible decision. And interestingly enough, at the time, the media, somebody who wrote for the media at the time, who's no longer there, thought that he had blown it and that the pulp mill was going to close, and so she wrote immediately what a loser he was for not getting up fast enough on his feet and saving that industry. But in fact, at the 11th hour, he did manage to save the industry and make an offer to that industry which would keep them going. And so for several days after that, we didn't hear much from that particular media person. She probably felt a little embarrassed at jumping the gun, and then she never really backtracked. But I do know that I was in meetings in economic and rural development committee meetings where it was pointed out to us that if you let that particular factory plant die, it didn't just affect the 1,200 or so immediate workers, but it also affected every little mom and pop operation across the province who delivers wood to that operation. And so therefore it was a very large, significant amount of Nova Scotia's GDP that would in fact be affected. So I know that these decisions are not taken lightly. And I know that the finance minister is a very principled person, and from all of my dealings with her over the years, I have great respect for her. And I know how hard she works, and I know that it's not easy. And when you do make a decision, you do get attacked, and you can't make everybody happy. But I do have to say that when you look at different governments and you see where they spend their money or where they shave off the money and where they cut, tells you what the priorities of that government are. And one of the things I have noticed is that while cutting a lot of these programs for health and wellness and community services and the film and creative industries, these particular cuts are small, but they are devastating for the people in this province who need this help and who are relying on this to keep their industries alive. So, for instance, under health and wellness, the community grant program, which is part of the Together We Can mental health strategy, they've cut the Self-Help Connection, the Eating Disorder Nova Scotia, the 3-year, $49,000 grant, it's been reduced by 23%. This affects the group's ability to continue to provide peer support for those impacted by eating disorders, education for adults like guidance counselors and teachers, sharing accurate, up-to-date information with the community. Also, the Split Rock Learning Center Association in Yarmouth. That grant has been reduced by 23%. The Free Spirit Therapeutic Writing Association in Berwick, the grant of $30,000 reduced by 23%. Immigrant Settlement and Integration Services in Halifax, a grant of $73,000 reduced by 23%. Schizophrenia Society of Nova Scotia, a grant of $60,000 reduced by 23%. Alzheimer's Society of Nova Scotia reduced by 23%. Shabukto Connections in Spryfield reduced by 23%. St. George's Youth Net Society reduced by 23%. Then we've got the community services, the discretionary grants for the Canadian Mental Health Association, the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, the Deafness Advocacy Association of Nova Scotia, Feed Nova Scotia, the Metro Food Bank, Heartwood Centre for Community Youth Development, Nova Scotia Association for Community Living, Nova Scotia Council for the Family, People First. People First? I can't believe that you allowed them to cut that. Youth Voices of Nova Scotia Society. All of these are about people. And as far as I'm concerned, we should be about the people. And every second word that I've heard from the government since sitting in the House and since I've heard about the budget is private enterprise, private enterprise, private enterprise. We also know that we're going to be looking at, the government's looking at privatizing the home care support workers now. And that whole organization, the VON, is going to affect so many people. We know that one of the first protests around the House this year or last year were the home care workers, and these are the oldest workforce in Nova Scotia, mainly all women, and they make not enough money to do the kind of work that they do, and they were asking for a $2 a day raise. And instead of getting the $2 a day raise, they were told, no, we're not going to give you the raise, and also, by the way, we're going to legislate it so that it's illegal for you to strike because you're essential, you're an essential care worker. Well, I'd like to say, well, if you're so essential, why not give them the $2 a day raise? I mean, if they're that essential, then please, give these people the respect and the financial help that they need. During the election, the government talked about all the time was people, 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 and they made so many promises to so many groups, and yet over and over and over again, these groups have been disappointed, and they're in shock. Now, I know that the members on the other side criticize our government for many decisions that we made, and some of those I agree with. I agree that they were mistakes, but we also did so many very, very, very good things. And I was proud to be part of that first ever NDP government. And in fact, I actually was looking recently, I came across some information that it just reminded me again how, we opened the first collaborative emergency care centers that provided 24/7 emergency care and same or next day appointments. And 8 of them were opened, and then ER closures during that time were reduced 4 years in a row. Why isn't this government investing in more collaborative emergency care centers? We know that there's a crisis in the system. So the NDP also launched the first ever strategy to help Nova Scotians and their families who are living with mental health and addictions. And I remember the health minister at that time over and over and over again talking about that. And yet now we see cuts. The NDP fair drug pricing plan. I was so proud of our health minister at the time. That was the woman who then became our first female finance minister. She was the healthcare minister for 3 years. And during that time, she went toe-to-toe with the pharmaceutical companies and brought generic drugs in Nova Scotia down from 85% to 35%. That is huge. That is huge. I just remember being so proud of being part of a government who would actually do that for the people and the seniors who need it so desperately. We also reversed drastic cuts to the children's dental care that had been made by the previous Liberal government. And we increased the age for children's basic dental care from 10 to 13, and we were planning on extending it to age 17. And I note that this government is not going to be extending it to age 17. Personally, I think that dental care should be part of health care, period. There are so many seniors in this province who cannot afford dental care, and it makes you sick. As an MLA, I'm sure many of you have had some of the same situations as I have, where people come when they're in desperate need, where they have to have surgery, dental surgery done, which costs the province thousands of dollars. And we all know that you can get sick in your stomach from bad dental and hygiene, oral hygiene. So again, I think that dental care, basic dental care for all, is something that should be looked at. We also recruited more rural doctors. We hired more nurse practitioners. Ambulance fees were waived for low-income Nova Scotians and for seniors with mobility issues. This is looking at people. Everyday, ordinary people who need the help, who want to know that they have a government who actually cares about them. And I feel that a lot of those people right now are hurting, and they feel that they are not being listened to and their cares are not being taken seriously. We also expanded newborn screening tests to include cystic fibrosis, sickle cell anemia, and also 8 other conditions. We brought the emergency room to people with the Restore program so that paramedics could administer clot-busting drugs to patients having a heart attack instead of waiting and arriving at the hospital and dealing with it. We expanded Lucentis treatment, and that was a big issue when we first got in government, was Lucentis. It was not covered, and we ended up covering that. And we did balance the budget. And it's interesting because only 3 other provinces at that time were able to do so. And for the first time ever in the history of Nova Scotia, our first NDP government managed to get a AAA credit score. I think that is huge, and we got no credit for it. In fact, at the time, in the media, it was buried, that piece of news was buried on, say, the 14th page of the Halifax Chronicle Herald on a tiny, tiny little piece. I thought it should have been on the front page of the newspaper. That's huge. And that's, in fact, why we are able to get low interest rates, because we have a good credit rating. Many economists would say that austerity budgets don't work, and that, in fact, we should be investing at a time and investing in more infrastructure and investing in people because interest rates are low. While interest rates are low, they say that is the time to borrow. So austerity budgets aren't necessarily the way that people should be going, and I think it's interesting that this government has chosen to do that. We also increased minimum wage 4 years in a row. So, and that was despite opposition pressure to limit the increases. And we established Arts Nova Scotia. We brought back the Arts Council in Nova Scotia, which had been decimated by the former Conservative government 9 years before. And I remember the Premier, who was then the leader of the opposition, standing on the front steps of this legislature saying to a whole crowd of artists, we're just one election away from bringing back the Arts Council. And guess what? We did. And I'm proud of that. I'm also proud of the fact that we passed status of the artist legislation to acknowledge the importance of our artists and to show that we are listening to them. And the other thing that we did was we improved the film tax credit to make us a much more competitive province than the rest of Canada. As the finance minister now has alluded to, there are 3 other provinces that have better tax credits than we do. We are the 4th province. But if we continue on this path right now, we will no longer be the 4th province. And for a tiny little province like Nova Scotia, whether she wants to argue semantics about whether we're the 4th largest or the 5th largest, I have to say I'm proud of Nova Scotia. I've lived in Hollywood. I've lived in New York. I've lived in Chicago. I've lived right across Canada. And I chose to move back here to Nova Scotia because we have a thriving community here. And I think if anything was proven by this whole exercise, the rally and all of the letters and all of the blogs and the Facebook posts and the tweets and everything else shows that we have a thriving and passionate creative community, and we need to save that community, we need to support that community, and we need to keep them here. Because as we know, we have an aging population. We have a rapidly aging population. 1,000 Nova Scotians turn 65, I believe, every week. Isn't it every week? Every month or every week? I think it's every week. But anyway, it's huge. And we know that we're not alone in this. Japan has a rapidly aging population as well. Many other places do. But we have to keep in mind that we need to invest in our youth. We need to give our youth reasons to stay here. We need to give the youth reasons to move here. And I can tell you right now that the creative economy is the way to do that, as well as the green economy. And we've heard the Ecology Action Center people talking about the green economy. And to see their faces light up and the excitement that comes in their eyes when they talk about this, and they talk about a vision for the future of Nova Scotia, that is the vision that I believe in, and that's what I want to see for this province. I don't want to see us going down the same old tired road that so many other governments have done over and over and over the years. And I'm sorry, but it just doesn't wash. And we need to think differently. That's what the Ivany report was about. It's about thinking outside of the box. It's not about coloring inside of the lines. It's about coloring outside of the lines and, in fact, adding some pieces and changing the picture. That's what we have to do. And in order to do that, you need creative people. You need people with imagination and passion and vitality. That's the kind of Nova Scotia that I believe in, and I think we have all the pieces that we can create that beautiful place for all of us to grow old in, and for our daughters and sons and our grandchildren to grow up and enjoy for many years as well, if we do the right thing. So the last thing I want to talk about is the 10-year plan for agriculture, our homegrown success. Under the NDP, we started having more and more farms where everybody else in the country was losing their farms. So we were putting our money where our mouth was with many of these different programs. And we also we made changes and investments too for ensuring that the lands formerly owned by Bowater were not sold to foreign interests, which was a distinct possibility. We were starting to create community forests and a center for cleaner energy, bioenergy, and forestry innovation. These are exciting things. And guess what? They attract young people. They attract young people who want to work in those industries. The other thing that we did was that we made sure that every pre-age school child with autism got the help that they needed. We invested $8 million in that program, which was help that was previously only available to half of them. we also started the Early Childhood Development Program. And I know, now that I've been in government and now that I've been on both sides of the House for a little while, I see how governments tend to take the good things that the last government did and then put their own stamp on it and say it's their own idea. Well, yeah, we did the same thing. Every government does that, and I think it stinks. I think it's wrong. I think that we need to start giving credit where it's due, and where you guys do really good things, I think it's time for us to give you credit too. For instance, Home for Colored Children, good on ya. About time. Yes, indeed. I agree, you did the right thing there. Very proud of that. The boat harbor, I think it's wonderful. I think it's about time. That has been going on for 60 years, and the First Nations people, 60 years, 50 or 60 years, the Northern Pulp, right? You know, and the First Nations people in Pictou First Landing have been dealing with that issue and trying to tell people and bring people, the attention of people to the problem, which to me, well, this is environmental racism. And our province, unfortunately, has had a history of racism, as do many other places. And it's time for us to address these wrongs of the past. And so, again, I say kudos to you. But again, when a government has done something good, let's say so. That's what people want to hear. They don't want to hear people bickering and fighting over chairs on the Titanic. They want to hear people say, yes, good on you, you did a good thing, and guess what? We're going to improve this. We're going to work together, and we're going to improve things. We're going to improve life for everyday, ordinary Nova Scotians, and not just for the very richest of the rich. And this is why some people are very concerned about the concept that we are constantly hearing private enterprise, that government doesn't invest, doesn't do anything with business, it's up to the private businesses. This sounds like a very Republican idea, actually, like the Republican Party in the United States, and that scares me. That really scares me, because that's more right-wing than even the Prime Minister in Canada, what he's been doing. And we know that he's been doing a lot of damage for our brand around the world, including our incredible, beautiful forests and our waterways, taking away all of our the protections. And so, again, I say that it's time that we start giving credit where credit is due, and we acknowledge the good things that different governments have done. I want to also mention about the cyber safety program and the cyber safety law, the first one that was ever introduced here in Nova Scotia, and in fact the first one in Canada. I know firsthand how important that is, and I know that that particular cyber safety squad, that unit, has so many cases right now that they can barely get to all of them. And it's not just the young people, it's also seniors. Seniors are being cyberbullied, and seniors are cyberbullying. And a lot of people are new to this whole internet. You know, older people are new to it. They're still figuring it out. And in fact, the bullying and the harassment and sexual harassment that goes on online is a huge issue. Sexual assault on our campuses is a huge issue. And 1 out of every 5 young women or young people that go to college, they are attacked and they are sexually assaulted while they should be focusing on their studies and enjoying their young life. And many of them drop out because they don't have the supports there to help them. So again, I think that these are the sort of things I would like to see this government focusing on. We also extended the moratorium on gas and oil drilling on Georges Bank indefinitely, and I'm really proud of that as well. We also made it illegal to be mining for uranium, and we also got rid of cosmetic pesticide use, something that I know Prince Edward Island is right now in the throes of, because the cosmetic pesticide kills our bee population. And in Prince Edward Island, that's huge, because without bees, you don't have any potatoes, you don't have anything, which is why I think that, again, kudos to the former government for doing that. We also thought, as government, that it was very important for us to protect 13% of our province's land, which exceeded the United Nations goal of 12% land protection. So we built the future of forestry with the creation of community forests. We started to do that, and we wanted to enhance all the natural parks because we wanted to protect 13% of our province's land for the people. The people own that land, the people of Nova Scotia. That's an amazing thing. We also invested in local food campaigns, farmers markets, and as I said, help for new farmers. And one other thing that we did, which I asked in estimates the other day, was we invested $750,000 in a breakfast program, a provincial breakfast program for children. Because we all know that it's very difficult for kids to learn on an empty stomach. And sadly, there is too much poverty in Nova Scotia. Way too much poverty, and many kids are coming to school hungry. And I don't think it should be up to charity, the charity of teachers and parents, to have to run around and try and do little fundraisers to be able to pay for kids so that they have food in their stomachs, so they can focus on their studies and that they can grow healthily. I think a country and a province needs to focus on the health and the education and the creativity of its children, because those are the roots and the seeds of the future. And one other thing that we did that I'd like to also mention is that we did reduce poverty by 18% in the 4 years that we were in government. And this particular government now has not increased income assistance in the last 2 years. In fact, they've frozen it. So between the bus passes that are hard for people to get, between the frozen income assistance, between with all of the cuts to the many different programs that help the very poorest of the poor and the people who need it the most, persons with disabilities. I'm glad to see that there is money going into that, but there's so much more we can do. Transportation, public transportation, transportation in the rural districts. Why are we driving people out of our beautiful rural districts? We need to bring them into the rural districts. What better way to do it than through the creative economy? Tatamagouche is an excellent example of that. They've got the Creamery Square there. They've got a brilliant little museum, state of the art. They've got 2 stages, an indoor stage and an outdoor stage, and a fantastic farmers market. And that community is thriving. Another reason why that community has started to thrive is because they became a learning community. And they also had a television series called The Week the Women Went, which attracted much attention around the world. People wanted to come to Tatamagouche, Nova Scotia, and see it for themselves. And in Salmon River, which is part of my riding, we had Hockeyville there. They were lucky enough to win the Hockeyville contest and become Hockeyville. And again, that put us on the map. Now, I'm proud to say I'm the MLA for Sunnyvale, so that the Trailer Park Boys are in fact my constituents when they're in character for their show. And I don't want to lose it. I don't want them to go to New Brunswick. We want to keep them in Truro. We're very proud of those boys, and we're proud of the show that goes all around the world and puts Nova Scotia on everybody's television set. What's that? And no feral cat program. I know. But again, my colleagues here, Haven affects Chester, Call Me Fitz affects Wolfville. The Book of Negroes, helped with Shelburne and Birchtown. And this summer, there's going to be a tour, a Book of Negroes tour, a tourism tour, where people can come and see all the various different points where the history of the Black Loyalists of Nova Scotia were So I do have one more question actually for the minister, which is, what kind of financial, did she really look at the books to see how much this industry is worth to Nova Scotia, to the economic spin-off of our tiny little province? Not just the direct jobs, but the economic spin-off for every one of these little communities, because that's what I would think you would need to do if you're going to cut something as important as our film tax credit, which I believe the government is now starting to realize why it's so important and why it means so much to so many people. And before I turn it over to the minister, I just want to point out that in Australia, where I was born, our golden years of film that put Australia on the map were when we had a social democratic government led by Golf Whitlam, who invested in our film and television community there. And that's when we had a ton of movies and television shows that came out, like Mad Max, Road Warrior, The Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith, Picnic at Hanging Rock, The Wave, Peter Weir, all of these, Crocodile Dundee. Until Crocodile Dundee came out, my accent back then wasn't very cool, but it came out, and all of a sudden, that ain't a knife, this is a knife, became the popular saying in my school. That show and those movies helped to put Australia on the map and make people want to go and see all those dingoes and kangaroos and wallabies and crocodiles. And we can do the same here in Nova Scotia. So let's get with it. Let's get on the train. Let's get on the clean, green train for energy, for our creative arts and culture, and looking after the people who need it most, so that we have a very robust and healthy society here in Nova Scotia. So with that, I would like to ask the Minister, what did you do to look into the economic spin-offs and how much money actually was created for our domestic product here, and the spin-offs in all of the little communities across Nova Scotia before you made the decision to change the film and television tax credit? Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I appreciate having the member from Truro, Bible Hill, Salmon River, and did I get it all? Big long, Millbrook, Salmon River. There you go. Long title for that riding. I appreciate the comments that she's raised and the enthusiasm and I know dedication that she brings to her job. And I would also like to commend her for having had a career in the arts and in film, which is not an easy thing to achieve, to be successful and to be able to do that exclusively and make that your career is a real accomplishment. I understand that no matter which area of the arts you're in, it's very hard to make that a full-time career that pays the bills and looks after your life. And I know, particularly in front of the camera, it's a big job to do. So I appreciate that, and I know she's had experience around the world. We've had the chance to talk about it in different times in Europe and Scandinavia, and you said you lived in Los Angeles as well. And I appreciate that, and I appreciate her comments about Australia as well. I'm not sure, but I think the member opposite does know that I lived in Sydney, Australia for 2 years, had the opportunity to see a number of films that were made there, and appreciate the quality of the work that they did. And again, they have a very unique culture, you know, quite isolated when you think of the place they are geographically in the world, and they celebrate it. And they're not a large country, not even as big a country in terms of population as Canada, and yet they have really well-known writers and storytellers and artists. So I appreciate that, and that would certainly be something that would be great to take as a model for any country. It's an interesting place to live, and I was privileged to have the chance to be there. I would mention they also have a lot of different rules around labor and minimum wage and holiday times. When I introduced the idea of a single extra holiday in Nova Scotia, I'm sorry, but the former Premier wasn't interested in moving on that. I think he might have been sympathetic. I hope he was. In Australia, when I started to work there in the 1980s, I would say, there were 4 weeks a year holiday for everybody. It was my first job. I was not from there. I get a new job. 4 weeks, thank you very much. Holidays per year. I couldn't believe it. It wasn't with government either. It was in the private sector. So they had an $8 an hour minimum wage at the time that I lived there in the 1980s. So you can imagine how that compared to our minimum wage. So very different culture, very different economies, and some things that I thought were very, very good. And as I say, that 4 weeks annual leave doesn't even take account of how many days they would have had for national holidays and state holidays. So I can't tell you the number of that because I don't remember exactly, but I know that Nova Scotia had the fewest in Canada. And I'm pleased that we have added one more day to that list. We now have 6 holidays plus the Special Remembrance Day Act. And so, you know, again, we said we will acknowledge what good things happen under different governments. And certainly that's just one I'd like to mention, because the member opposite does know, Madam Chair, that I've raised that with 4 different premiers, and the current premier said, yes, let's do that. So I think that there were a lot of evidence that it was a good thing to do, and certainly, why did I think of it? One reason was that I've lived in other provinces, I've lived in other countries, and I know that you don't have to have the fewest holidays to be productive, that productivity has a lot of elements. So I think the members of the House know that I do understand some of the nuances around things. They're not always black and white. It isn't just that there's a cost to business, which I acknowledge, but there's also a benefit to the people of Nova Scotia to have that extra holiday. And a lot of people do not get the holidays that government workers and others get. A lot of people are really held to the minimum wage, to the minimum standards in workplaces, and it's up to government to make those changes. So I mention that because it is important. Now also, I'm watching the time, Madam Chair. I know that there's not too much time left. I think you said 7:16, so, and I do have a resolution to read. I did want to mention, though, because a number of speakers today have talked about the need for or they mentioned certain cuts or reductions, and the member opposite had just mentioned the cuts, the idea that a number of health and other grants had been cut by 23%. But I think what's been missed as well in the discussion, and I'd like to mention just a few of them, is that there has actually been, under just community services, $4 million extra going out in grants to organizations. And I think it is something that would be of interest to the members in the House as well, just to know that there's a lot of different organizations on this list. The Elizabeth Fry Society has $63,000. SHIFT, which is something that would be well known to people, it's a youth program. It actually was not funded under the NDP. It was cut. And the funding here is $350,000 for SHIFT, with SHYFT, capital letters is how you spell that. The Whitney Pier Youth Boys and Girls Club has extra funding here. The Family Service Association, Alice Housing, the Nova Scotia Native Women's Association, the Colchester Sexual Assault Centre has extra funding. I'm just trying to go through. Lee Place Women's Centre has extra. Okay, there's all the women's centres and transition houses. I see Bryony House, $148,000 increase. These are all increases. As I say, when you come to the end of it, you'll see a lot of funding, a lot of women's funding that had been neglected for years under successive governments. So women's centres and transition houses, the funding for sexual assault, our strategy, and for the sexual assault centres, those are all really important as well. And I know that the members opposite would appreciate that. Some of these are literacy. I saw a literacy one. I see Phoenix House for Phoenix youth programs. Let me just look. One certainly was for literacy here as well. Richmond County Literacy Network gets increased funding. Anyway, in total, the amount is $4,088,600 additional funding. And I just think that needs to be noted. Very much. The funding that in some of the other organizations does not diminish the work that they do. It doesn't say that the work isn't good. The funding has not been eliminated. It has been reduced. And one would hope that in coming budgets we'll be in a different position as well. It recognizes, because it's still getting funding, that we see value in the work that organizations are doing. But as I said earlier, if you count up all of the grant programs in all of our departments, it's in the hundreds of millions of dollars. So a lot of the work that is being done is not within government. It's money going out the door supporting other organizations. So that was something I just wanted to mention as we were going through a little bit on this. I was pleased that the member opposite as well talked about the Back to Balance tour under the finance minister. That was the first finance minister under the NDP government. I had attended a couple of the sessions that were in the metro area, and I did understand that many of the same themes were being discussed there as were discussed in my recent tax tour around the province, and the discussions that we have around the pressures on our government. As I said, the outcome of the Back to Balance tour was increasing the HST. That option, as I've said earlier today, isn't available to the government. We already have we have recovered that, if you like, that 2 cents that the federal government had left. We under the NDP, we went back to 15 cents, which was what we were used to on the dollar, taking more money for the province. But that option is not available now. As I said before, there are no easy choices. There are a lot of difficult choices. The same could be said for last year when we had the graduate retention rebate and looked at that and looked at the evidence of how well it was working and recognized that it was not doing what it was intended to do. I talked yesterday about how sometimes there are great tax ideas that we might raise as private members or as a perhaps it comes in an election campaign, that something looks good, but when you actually look at it and measure it, it doesn't serve its purpose. One of the suggestions in the Broughton report on taxes was that when you introduce a new program, and it might also have been in the economic development studies that were done by Tom Travis and others, that when we looked at how we could do economic development differently, they said, I think that's where it came from, when you bring in a new program, there should be an automatic 5-year review. So no program gets in place that people think is there forever, that it has to show its worth, that it has to be measured. And that was one of the suggestions for new programs. I've said already that we don't introduce very many new programs because we just don't have the capacity. But anytime programs come into place, they should always be set on a path where you're going to review them and see whether or not they're effective and whether they meet the aims that people had in mind when they're brought in. Because I'm sure no government brings stuff in that is not, that doesn't have a deadline, that they don't bring things in that don't have some use. They're addressing a need and they try and introduce a program to meet that need. So anyway, I think that's true for all governments, and with that, not yet? I thought my time's up. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought my time was up. I'm almost ready to read my resolution, but as I said, when we introduce new programs, you do it, and we should all ask ourselves, why are we doing this? What need does it meet? And we should see if it actually is a good way to address that need. But you know, it's only natural that if you look at the same program 20 years from now, it may be entirely different. Look at the technology changes. Madam Chair, you can just see yourself how technology changes, how we'd never have imagined using Facebook or having cell phones that would give us our emails just a few short years ago, that you could look up locations and restaurants and what's the closest tourist attraction. You can plan, and exactly, people are, no resolutions. Oh, okay. Well, that's too bad. Anyway, what I say is we have to keep pace and we have to review our programs as they're introduced. And in that regard, I think it's important that we note that will be an ongoing plan for this government. Certainly no new programs are coming in for business, for individuals, or any other thing that we don't review periodically on a regular basis as we bring them in. So I would hope that members of the opposition will watch for that and hold us to it. Because what happens is things are adopted, they become entrenched, everybody feels that they must have them, that they're essential, that they can't change in any way. And you know, the fact is that we have to be able to review and assess, and we will use the best evidence that we've got, and that has been done in the past. I said that this year's budget, with all of the difficult choices, there was a lot of time spent on each and every decision and a lot of concern shown for each one. I only have to go back to the number of civil servants who actually lost their jobs on budget day. This is not something that I, you know, sleep lightly with. That earlier question from the opposition was, you know, how worried am I about interest payments and so on. There are a lot of things to worry about, but I certainly worry about the individuals who feel that you know, who are directly impacted, whose families are impacted. And just to go back to the member's question about the film tax credit, it's really important to note, and I'd like to reiterate, that there is goodwill between Screen Nova Scotia and the representatives that are at the table. There's good discussions underway. I think we can find common ground because I think there's a willingness, and I think the best thing that I heard said ever was that we've certainly said we want to see an active industry in this province. We want to ensure that the benefits are for Nova Scotians, but we know that they will be if we can just make sure that there's an ongoing industry.
Order.
But at the
Order, please. The time allotted for consideration of supply today has elapsed. I recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Madam Chair, I move that the committee do now rise and report progress to the House.
The motion is carried. The committee will now rise and report its business to the House.
please. The Chair of the Committee of Whole House on Supply reports.
That the Committee of the Whole on Supply has met and has made considerable progress and begs leave to sit again.
The Honourable Government House Leader
Mr. Speaker, would you please call government business bills for third reading?
will now call government business with bills for third reading.
Speaker, would you please call Bill number 79, the Civil Service Act?
We'll now call Bill number 79, the Civil Service Act. The Honourable Minister of the Public Service Commission.
Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill 79, an act to amend Chapter 70 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Civil Service Act, be now read a third time and do pass. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians expect to have an efficient public service that effectively delivers services they depend on. The Civil Service Act is being amended to simplify procedure and clarify that deputy heads may delegate in writing those powers and duties that have been delegated to them by the Public Service Commission. Remove unclear and redundant sections on citizenship and eligibility to work in Canada, and make some general housekeeping changes. Mr. Speaker, under the Civil Service Act, a deputy head's powers related to human resource management are delegated to him or her by the Public Service Commission. The Act provides a mechanism for deputy heads to subdelegate authority to manage aspects of the day-to-day operations. Mr. Speaker, by simplifying and clarifying the authorities of deputy heads, they will be able to administer their departments more efficiently, improving day-to-day operations. Mr. Speaker, removing outdated language or redundant clauses in the Civil Service Act includes removing a hiring preference for residents of Canada. People will only need to have authorization to work in Canada to be hired in the public service. These changes are in line with key government priorities, and they support broader government workforce and immigration strategies. They also bring us in line with most other Canadian jurisdictions. Finally, Mr. Speaker, the amendments to the Civil Service Act will clean up and modernize language in the Act. This includes making the language gender neutral. Mr. Speaker, I would like to now close debate on third reading of Bill 79.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, I have concerns with this bill. I understand the government is trying to be supportive of immigration into our province, but Mr. Speaker, I represent an area of high unemployment. I represent an Aboriginal population of almost 1,000 people, Mr. Speaker, where there's high unemployment. There are companies that are working with the band at Wakaba to try to improve employment prospects for those individuals. They are working very successfully at Port Hawkesbury Paper, as one example. There are efforts being made by, I know, an LNG terminal. It's been in the papers the last couple of weeks where they're trying to come to an agreement. Mr. Speaker, my challenge with this bill is that all things being equal, Canadians can be overlooked for positions. And there are a lot of Canadians I represent in my riding, my constituency, Mr. Speaker, that are looking for employment. What do I say to them? Do I say that I sat in the legislature quietly and let this bill pass when many of them are looking for employment here in this province, wanting to stay in this area? I have great difficulty supporting a bill and going back to them and telling them, Mr. Speaker, that I didn't stand up and say, wait a minute, there are Canadians who could benefit from these jobs, Mr. Speaker, including Canadians, and I think especially if the Aboriginal population I represent, people who were here long before Canada became Canada and we called ourselves Canadians. So, Mr. Speaker, with that, I will take my place.
If I'm to recognize the Honourable Minister of the Public Service Commission, it will be to close third reading on Bill number 79. The Honourable Minister of the Public Service Commission.
Mr. Speaker, I would just like to make one comment. I find it contradictory to say that a government will give somebody the ability to work in Canada but we will not allow them to work in the public service or for government. And that is what this bill does. It gets rid of that inequality. I'd also like to say that immigrants, when they come to Canada, they tend to not work for the public service. They tend to actually be entrepreneurial and actually come into our community and create jobs. I'll speak to my experiences in the Greek community. We have 2,000 people who are immigrants in this community in Halifax. None of them work in the public service. Lebanese community, over 10,000 people in HRM, and there's a handful, about 5, that work in the public service. Mr. Speaker, when you have a government that wants to be representative of the population, immigrants are not looking at the public service or looking at government, because when they come here, a lot of times they have language barriers and they might not even qualify for those positions. So it tends to be that the only positions they can get is working for themselves. And when they do, we've seen the success stories across the communities that have come here. The Dutch, what they've done in agriculture, the Italians when they came, the Greeks, the Lebanese now, and all immigrants that are coming to Canada. They don't come here looking to work for government. They actually come here, and because of challenges they face, they actually tend to start industry, and they hire Canadians, and they increase the value of Canada, and they increase all of our economic ability to move forward. And Mr. Speaker, with that, I'd like to now close debate on Bill 79. Thank you.
Motion is for third reading of Bill number 79, the Civil Service Act. Would all those in favor of the motion please say aye? Aye. Contrary minded, nay. Motion is carried.
Bill number 79, an act to amend Chapter 70 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Civil Service Act.
Ordered that the bill do pass and the title be as read by the clerk. Ordered that the bill be engrossed. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Speaker, would you please call Bill number 83, the Elections Act?
Will now call Bill number 83, the Elections Act. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I move that Bill number 83, amendments to the Nova Scotia Elections Act, be now read a third time. During second reading and law amendments, Mr. Speaker, we heard from members of this House and stakeholder groups about this bill. I want to thank everyone for their points that they brought forward. In particular, I want to thank Mr. Mark Coffin from Springtide Collective for sharing valuable information with us. I commend the work that they're doing to improve our democratic system. Secondly, I would also like to acknowledge Mr. Parker Dunham's important points regarding our youth and getting them more involved in the electoral process. I absolutely agree. We must continue to encourage our young people to vote, and I am confident the amendments brought forward will improve that. Mr. Dunham makes a valid point on their engagement with social media and technology with respect to the youth. As Justice Minister, I must balance that with other values, such as protecting the sanctity of the ballot. And I just want to share only one personal story on the importance of the secret ballot. One that I thought about actually when we were coming to make amendments to the Election Act, and when I heard the comments that were made by Mr. Dunham at law amendments. When I was campaigning for the 2013 election, I, just like everyone in this House, went door to door, and I met so many wonderful, great, interesting people. On two such occasions, Mr. Speaker, I spoke with two wonderful women in my riding who shared something very powerful with me. You know what they told me, Mr. Speaker, and I reflected on that the last probably 10 days or so. Going into an election and walking in with their husbands to vote, leaving that husband at the door and they going behind that ballot box and putting the X on the ballot is the only thing that they've done in their life without their husband being with them, and it's the only thing that they've ever done that can be kept a secret for them. To these women, those values were empowering. It was clear to me that affirmed the importance of the secret ballot, and that we as individuals and collectively as a society must safeguard that long-held belief by many of the importance of the secret ballot. Mr. Speaker, the amendments to the bill also maintain the integrity of our elections while improving access to voting for electors and overall improve the electoral process. These important amendments will extend voting opportunities and permit constituents to vote at any returning office or advanced voting location in the province. Ballots will be improved, which will reduce the reliance on write-in ballots and decrease ballot error. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased that these changes will make significant improvements to adapting the use of technology. Voters will be able to register online. Scrutineers will be able to correspond through text and email to their headquarters. And the ban on Election Day advertising will be lifted to align with modern forms of advertising, including websites and social media. I also like to note that after review of the initial bill, we made an amendment to include that Elections Nova Scotia will remain as the arbiter of election advertising. This bill, in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, represents a positive step forward to Nova Scotia as voting opportunities are extended, ballots are improved, and accessibility for candidates has been enhanced. I believe these amendments provide Nova Scotians with much-needed practical amendments and is responsive to the needs of a modern electorate, given the rapid changes in technology and the increasing mobility of voters. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to rise again to speak to this bill. And I do recognize the minister's points about improving various aspects of the Elections Act. However, as we have mentioned before, that the main issue we'd have with this bill, Mr. Speaker, is the glaring lack of a fixed election date in the bill. And the elections report from Elections Nova Scotia, as you will recall, said in the main point was that most of the recommendations they made hinged on having a fixed election date. Not only that, Mr. Speaker, the fixed election date would save the province approximately $1.6 million. And I recognize that we're in a time of discussing the budget, and there's been a number of austerity measures, and some of the civil servants have lost their jobs, and I know none of that is easy. And for the stroke of a pen here, we could have another $1.6 million in savings that could be put somewhere else in our system. And it's very unfortunate that that has not taken place, simply so that the government would have the option of calling an election at their convenience rather than at the convenience of or with everyone being aware of and anticipating the date. So there's considerable savings to be had in a fixed election date, Mr. Speaker, and we are, again, I would express very great disappointment in the fact that that's not in the bill. Furthermore, I know that the party in power, our government, it was in favour of fixed election dates, and on numerous occasions have stated that they wanted fixed election dates while in opposition. And in fact, early in the mandate, I recall the Premier saying that they would bring in a fixed election date. And for those reasons, for that main reason, which is a very significant reason, we do not support this bill, and very disappointed with that lack of that fixed election date in the bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
If I'm to recognize the Honourable Minister of Justice, it will be to close third reading on Bill number 83, the Elections Act. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I move to close debate on Bill number 83.
Motion is for third reading of Bill number 83, the Elections Act. Would all those in favour of the motion please say aye. Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried.
Bill number 83, an act to amend Chapter 5 of the Acts of 2011, the Elections Act.
Ordered that the bill do pass and the title be as read by the clerk. Ordered that the bill be engrossed. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Speaker, would you please call Bill number 84, the Statute Law Repeal 2015 Act?
We'll now call Bill number 84, the Statute Law Repeal 2015 Act. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 84, the Statute Law Repeal 2015 Act, be now read for a third time and do pass.
Is it agreed? Motion is for third reading of Bill number 84, the Statute Law Repeal 2015 Act. Would all those in favor of the motion please say aye? Aye. Contrary minded, nay. Motion is carried.
Bill number 84, an act to repeal various statutes.
Ordered that the bill do pass and the title be as read by the clerk. Ordered that the bill be engrossed. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Speaker, would you please call under government business public bills for second reading?
We'll now call public bills for second reading.
Speaker, would you please call Bill number 89, the Boat Harbor Act?
We'll now call Bill number 89, the Boat Harbor Act. The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill 89 be now read a second time. Mr. Speaker, practice does make perfect. And after previous governments said they would stop the flow of effluent into Boat Harbor, we're doing it. Governments have been talking for 25 years. Mr. Speaker, in June 2014, a pipeline carrying waste from the northern pulp mill to the Boat Harbor Effluent Treatment Facility ruptured. It was dumping water and chemicals into Pictou Landing First Nation. As a result, the mill had to shut down its operations. The band began a peaceful blockade. The situation was resolved when this government promised to introduce legislation within a year to establish a reasonable timeline for the closure of the Boat Harbor Effluent Treatment Facility. We honor that commitment with this bill. Mr. Speaker, the Northern Pulp Mill, in its current and past iterations, has been an economic driver in the Pictou region for decades. The mill has provided well-paying jobs in the region, employed harvesters in local woodlands and sawmills, and has been a catalyst for job creation through the goods and services it buys from the community. That prosperity has not been without its drawbacks. Mr. Speaker, last summer we heard many complaints from Pictou residents about smells emanating from the mill's air emissions. However, for many years, the Pictou Landing First Nation community, as well as the broader community, have endured the smell of the effluent in Boat Harbor, a very pungent smell of sulfur. The bill we are considering today would close the Boat Harbor Effluent Treatment Facility by the end of January 2020. Five years seems like a long time, Mr. Speaker, and it is longer than the band would like to see. Unfortunately, there is no quick fix to Boat Harbor. It is a problem that evolved over almost 50 years. In 1967, effluent began to flow several kilometers to Boat Harbor through a pipeline from the then new paper mill at Abercrombie Point. At first, it was dumped into Boat Harbor without any treatment. By the early 1970s, an effluent treatment plant was built because so many people were worried about how the effluent could damage the environment. From the pipeline, Mr. Speaker, the effluent goes into settling ponds, where solids in the water fall to the bottom. They are collected and then moved to a landfill at the paper mill. The remaining wastewater stays in an aerated stabilization basin for about 5 days, where air is added to help very small organisms digest organic material. The wastewater remains in Boat Harbor for about 2 more weeks before it flows into the Northumberland Strait. Knowing what we know today, Mr. Speaker, we believe that 5 years is a reasonable time frame to close Boat Harbor and to begin remediation. It could take up to 5 years after the closure of Boat Harbor to fully remediate this site. At the bill briefing last week, Mr. Speaker, members of the media asked about what would replace the existing effluent treatment plant. This is a question that will be resolved in the future discussions with Northern Pulp. The design and cost of a new treatment plant will depend on the amount and the quality of wastewater flowing through the mill at that time. The fact is, Mr. Speaker, this legislation rights a wrong that has gone on too long. Previous governments, in conjunction with the mill, promised to close Boat Harbour several times in the 1990s, but they did not. In the 2000s, the governments of the day promised to close Boat Harbour, but they did not. Boat Harbour could have been remediated by now, but earlier governments changed their mind. On that note, Mr. Speaker, I shall take my seat, and I look forward to hearing from other members gathered here today.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise tonight and speak to this incredibly important bill. It's incredibly important that we have a solution that works for the people, works for the economy, and works for Pictou County and for indeed all of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. It's incredibly important for the people of my community. I care deeply about my community, and not just because I'm the MLA. I care because the people of the community are my friends, my neighbors, and my family. So when we sit in this chamber and talk about Boat Harbour, and we heckle or we say some things back and forward, know that I live 10 minutes from Boat Harbour. Boat Harbour, to me, is not something that's somewhere else. Boat Harbour is in my community, and it's an issue that's incredibly supercharged. It's an incredibly emotional decision for the people of my community. So as we discuss this bill, I am thinking of the people in my community. I am thinking of the families of my community. I'm thinking of the children of my community. I'm thinking of the seniors of my community. And I'm thinking about all those people and the people trying to make a living working in our community. And in Pictou County, and in all of rural Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, we all know the situation with rural Nova Scotia. It's harder and harder to make a living. So I'm thinking of all those people and the people that are working in the woods and driving trucks, and whatever the case may be. We want a solution that works for all of those people. And that solution is possible. It's not an easy solution, but it is possible, Mr. Speaker. So as we discuss this bill, I am thinking of all these people, and I am searching for a solution that works for everyone, a solution that works for Nova Scotia. That's what I'm searching for, and hopefully that is what all the members of this House are searching for, a solution that works. And I remember moving to Pictou County in 2007, and most of the people that I met when we first moved there were people that I met through my kids, through their school, through their sporting activities. And one of the first families I met was the Denny family, and it was actually through a birthday invitation. Their son invited my son to a birthday. And over the years, getting to know the Denny family, it's very interesting hearing these kids and my kids talk about Boat Harbour, driving past Boat Harbour, talking about Boat Harbour. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, there's not many people in this House that have had the opportunity to hear children talking about Boat Harbour. And it's a very powerful thing. So when I'm speaking about Boat Harbour, it's not words on a piece of paper to me, Mr. Speaker. It's an issue in my community. And I can tell you that I care deeply about Wayne and Bev and their children, and that extends to all of the people of the Pictou Landing First Nations. Chief Paul and the members of council, the many elders that have invited me into their home for tea, for a bite to eat. They've fed me and they've talked to me. And these are people that I respect because they know the meaning of honor. And I consider them my friends. I have many good friends in that community. And Mr. Speaker, I would say I count some of them amongst my best friends. So this is an important issue for me. This is not a political issue with words on a paper. And Pictou Landing is an area that encompasses much more than just the First Nations. And Boat Harbour is a concern for all of the residents, all the way from Pictou Landing First Nations to Hillside, back the other way through Little Harbour, Kings Head, Melmurby, and beyond to the greater Pictou County community. This is an extremely important issue to all of us. In the greater Pictou Landing area, I've sat on porches and in living rooms and listened to the concerns of the people and shared my concerns with them. We have the same concerns. We want the same things. And I'm thinking of Jane and Callum and Josie and Glenn and Sue. I could go on. I could name many people that I've sat and talked with about this issue and the other issues of our community. And I've listened to them over coffee and over conversation talk about the history of the area and talk about their dreams for the future of the area. This is not just an issue and a bill for me, Mr. Speaker, because these are people that I trust and respect, and these are people that I care about, and not because they're voters. I care about them because they're my friends, because they're my family. So when I tell you that Boat Harbour is a big issue in Pictou County, I'm talking from a place of sincerity because we all care about this issue. From the McLeans to the McGregors, to the Frasers, to the Gunnings, to the Sobies, to the Dutais, the names of Pictou County, each one concerned about this issue. And all people that I am proud to represent and proud to stand in this House and speak to issues on their behalf. So to me, this is an important bill. And as I discuss this bill, know that I am thinking of these people. And I want to stress to the Minister and to the Premier how important it is that we find a solution that works for everyone involved here. Nobody should question my affection for the people of my constituency and my sincere, heartfelt feeling that we deserve the best. Nobody should question that. All Nova Scotians deserve the best possible solutions to the very real issues we face. We all, as MLAs, come into this chamber and we try to make decisions that make the lives of Nova Scotians better, that make things better for Nova Scotians. We all want that, Mr. Speaker. And this is a well-intentioned bill. This bill speaks to an issue that we all recognize, and that is the status quo is not an option. The status quo is not an option for Boat Harbour. We all know that the status quo is not an option. We all accept that. We need to move forward. Tomorrow should always be better than yesterday. We should be always looking for ways to do things better. And the use of Boat Harbour to treat effluent is not the way of the future. It's not the way of the future, Mr. Speaker. And I don't think you could find a Nova Scotian that wouldn't say we need to find an alternative. I don't think you could find a Nova Scotian that wouldn't say we need a new, modern effluent treatment facility. Everyone wants a new, modern treatment facility, Mr. Speaker. because a new, modern treatment facility is what's needed. And I support this bill because it recognizes that we need to find a new way to treat the effluent. Now, the government hasn't done that yet. I hope they do. They've put a date down on a piece of paper. We can't claim success just yet, but I certainly hope that we see success on this bill. And as a father, and as a friend, and as a neighbor, and as an MLA for Pictou East, I will tell you, I know the status quo is not an option. And my party agrees. And I think back to Murray Scott's letter in 2008. And I didn't know much about politics back then, Mr. Speaker, and I still really don't. But back then, I'm learning, Mr. Speaker. And back then, the party realized that Boat Harbour couldn't go on. A new treatment facility was needed, and the Boat Harbour area needed to be remediated. That was obvious back to the PC party back in 2008, long before I was a member of it, Mr. Speaker. That government was defeated, and a new government was elected, and that government was defeated, and now we have a new government. So 7 years later, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to be standing here tonight and supporting this bill, and I support the replacement of Boat Harbour with the new treatment facility. We all should do that, and we all should do that because the status quo is not an option. So it's time to move forward with a plan that leads us to a treatment facility that is new and modern and protects the jobs and addresses the concerns of the community. We need a solution that moves Pictou County forward. So we're looking at this bill through that lens, Mr. Speaker. And let's make sure that this bill does move the county forward, and it does protect the environment, and it does protect the economy. We all want that. We all want that. And then looking through some of the media on the weekend, Mr. Speaker, I was reading the Chronicle Herald and I saw the comments from Matt Gunning. And it describes Matt, and I'll read from the Chronicle Herald, Mr. Speaker. I could table it if you like, but it says, but Matt Gunning, a spokesman for the environmental group Clean the Mill, says he doesn't want to get too excited until the details of the remediation plan are released. He goes on to say, Mr. Speaker, Clean the Mill supports the early shutdown and cleanup of the treatment facility, but the group is also concerned about maintaining jobs at Northern Pulp. And we're all concerned about those things, Mr. Speaker. And I saw some comments from the mill manager, Bruce Chapman, general manager at the mill. He said, our goal is to meet our environmental responsibilities while at the same time enabling the mill to have a long-term future. We all want the same thing, Mr. Speaker, and the mill's owner was also quoted in there, Pedro Chang. He says, we want to continue to be a long-term, environmentally and economically sustainable business in Pictou County and the surrounding areas. Everyone wants the same thing here, Mr. Speaker. So I hope, and it is my sincere hope, that there are plans underway to achieve these goals, to achieve the results the community needs and deserves. Now, on the face of it, Mr. Speaker, from what is visible to me, from where I stand, and what I heard from the minister at his press conference, is that there are no discussions taking place that have involved the mill. The minister said at his press conference, and I believe he said it in his opening comments tonight, that those discussions would start now. I hope he means that. I hope he meant it on Friday, Mr. Speaker, when he said it on Friday. In fact, I hope the now was Friday. I hope those discussions have started already. Because the only way to find real solutions is to involve all the stakeholders. And gee whiz, Mr. Speaker, we need a thorough plan to find a full solution. And that plan must involve everyone. That plan must involve the mill, Mr. Speaker. The mill is a big stakeholder in this process. And if it's true they haven't been involved so far, Mr. Speaker, that's a concern to me, and I sincerely hope that changes right away. I would have thought the mill might be involved in the drafting of this bill. So it makes me wonder what discussions are happening. If you want to find a real solution, if you want to solve a real problem, you talk to all the stakeholders. And I hear the members opposite, and it's probably a bit of a giggle for them to heckle Blood Harbour. But it's certainly not a bit of a giggle for me. Maybe some of these members can stand up and talk about it.
Order, please. The honourable member for Pictou East has the floor.
So I hope that those discussions happen. And I strongly encourage the minister to get those discussions going, because I can assure you we want this bill to work. And there is a lot of analysis and research and planning that has to happen in a relatively short period of time. 5 years is not a long time in the context of approvals and permits and major construction. So again, I urge the minister to include the stakeholders, to include the mill, to be involved, and to have the opportunity to be part of the solution. Because to leave them out would send the wrong message. It would send the wrong message to the people involved in this situation. And we can't have that, even if it's an inadvertent. So I urge the minister, open and keep open the communications. And when I look at this bill as drafted, I have questions. And my constituents have questions also. I have been asked, how will this happen? How do we make sure we get a new treatment facility put in place? How do we make sure that this is not just another broken promise? These are the questions people have. People want to know, what are the steps to get a new treatment facility in place by 2020? So when I look at this bill, when I look at the words on this paper, I can't answer those questions. I don't know the plan. But I hope there is a plan to make this happen. Because without a plan, without that detailed plan that people have said they're waiting for, without a plan, there's a risk that this bill just offers false hope. The people want real hope, Mr. Speaker. The people want a real solution. The people want to be part of that solution. We all want this to work. So how do we make sure that this is not just false hope? And over the next few days and weeks and months, we'll be looking forward to receiving answers to some of these questions that the people have. Questions like, what alternative treatment options are possible? Questions like, how will these alternatives be analyzed? Questions like, who will do the analysis? In fact, has there been an analysis done already? We don't know, Mr. Speaker. And maybe the minister has some ideas that have already been researched. These are the questions we have, Mr. Speaker. Does the minister have a timeline in mind that shows when he expects the application for environmental approvals for the new facility to be submitted? Does that timeline exist, Mr. Speaker? What does the timeline say when things will be approved? You know, what do the actual words of the bill mean? It's a short bill, Mr. Speaker. It's a one-page bill. And there's a couple paragraphs in there that we don't know what they mean. I don't know what they mean, Mr. Speaker. legal words about no action lies against Her Majesty, and is deemed not to be a repudiation of anticipatory repudiation. Mr. Speaker, I don't know what these things mean. We have questions. We have questions about this bill, and people are asking these questions. People are asking, why not wait until after the June 9th appeal? Is there any risk that this bill might prejudice that appeal and open the province to legal and financial risk? We don't know. No, and the biggest question of all, Mr. Speaker, why weren't Northern Pulp involved in the discussions? Does the minister think that the mill has a real part to play in working out a timeline? What's the plan to establish a working relationship with all the parties? These are just the questions that I heard over this weekend. And they're all legitimate questions because they're concerns. And the best way to overcome concern is with information. The only remedy for concern is understanding. And the people need to see, the people need to hear that the Liberals understand the importance of this bill and that they understand all the moving parts. Because when you put a bill like this down, it comes with a huge emotional factor to the people of the area. So we want to understand, we want to make sure that the government understands the importance of this bill. Now, this bill gives us a date, and we all want that date to work. We want that date to work for everyone, Mr. Speaker. And making it work for everyone is where I will focus. I'm going to focus on making this bill work. And that's where my party will focus. And it's my hope, it is my hope, Mr. Speaker, that I can be standing there with the government, cutting the ribbon the day that the switch is flicked and the affluent goes to a new treatment plant, because that will mean that it no longer runs into Boat Harbour. And that's what I want, Mr. Speaker. A new treatment facility that everyone can be proud of. And the Liberals have drawn a line in the sand here with the date, and I applaud them for that. And I want that line to work, and I'll do what I can to make sure that it works for everyone. But making sure that it works will require getting down to the business of creating a plan right now. No time can be wasted. The plans need to be worked out, financing secured. There's lots of moving parts here, Mr. Speaker. And this is my constituency. I live in the area. My friends live in the area. Many of my friends are either directly or indirectly employed by the mill. So I have a particular interest in seeing that this gets done right. And the history of Boat Harbour includes many broken promises. Many broken promises, Mr. Speaker. We can't have another broken promise. This has to be done right. And I hope the members opposite understand the weight of that. Because I am saying that while being mindful of what we have already seen with some bills in this legislature. And I'm thinking of the health bill, where an arbitrator ruled that the government couldn't do what it was trying to do. The arbitrator said, no, you can't do that. And I'm thinking of the tobacco bill, which had a false start and has now been brought back again for another try. I'm thinking of the film tax credit. In November, the Liberals passed a bill saying that they wouldn't change the film tax credit for 6 years. In April, they gutted it. So why do people say they are cautiously optimistic? Why do people say they hope it works? And we could go back through history and find many examples of politicians breaking promises. We could go back through history and find many examples of politicians changing laws. So I raise these examples only to stress that I want this bill to work and that it will require a well-thought-out plan to make it work. We need to have a plan, Mr. Speaker. And when I speak to the importance of this bill, and I hear some of the chatter over there, it just makes me wonder, Mr. Speaker, if the government understands the importance of this bill. And I know the Minister of Environment does. Well, I hope it works. I raise these examples only to stress that I want this bill to work, and it will require a plan. It will require a well-thought-out plan, a well-executed plan to get a full and proper solution that sees the effluent go to a new treatment facility. Because without a plan, there's a risk of failure. And let's not risk failure on this bill. Let's make sure there's a plan that works. Boat Harbour does need to be replaced. And finding the way to replace that facility without undermining the jobs, it's not the political thing to do, Mr. Speaker. It's the responsible thing to do. And this can't be about hollow words. It's too important, Mr. Speaker. So we look forward to seeing the timeline. It's often said that nothing happens without a timeline. So we want to see the timeline. We have to see a timeline for how do we get from here to there, Mr. Speaker. Can't underestimate how much work is going to be required in that. So let's involve the people of the community. Let's involve the people of the industry, the experts, because the idea for the most effective, efficient treatment facility might come from an unsuspecting place. So I hope there's a plan to ask and to listen and to get this right. So we all want tomorrow to be better than today on everything, whether it's your sports team or your job or your kid's future. We all want tomorrow to be better than today on everything. And progress comes from working together. Progress comes from collaborating. So, Mr. Speaker, in summary and in closing, I will say I support this bill, and I hope it works, and I will do whatever I can to make sure that it does work and that a new treatment facility is commissioned before 2020. So with those few words, I'll take my seat.
The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate listening to the words from the previous speaker, especially since Boat Harbour is within his constituent. Mr. Speaker, it's important to hear from those MLAs who are directly affected by some of the things that legislation is required to improve. I don't know if I heard this right, Mr. Speaker, when the minister first stood up to call second reading. I don't know if he implied that this legislation was perfect or if the government themselves were perfect for introducing it. But, Mr. Speaker, that's, I think, is far from the truth, especially there's many Nova Scotians who might not agree with that comment. And I say that because, Mr. Speaker, I was at the launch of this legislation at the news conference, and one thing that stood out to me was the limited details that this piece of legislation had. The first question that was asked of the minister from one of the media, the minister didn't know the answer and couldn't answer it. The second question, which surprised me, was around when did discussions with the mill take place, and It was the day before the news conference happened. And similar to my colleague who just spoke, that does concern me, because this issue, as was stated, has been around for a generation almost, Mr. Speaker, and there has been commitments from previous governments to do exactly what this piece of legislation is indicating it will do, Mr. Speaker, but there is limited details in here. And it surprises me that, the government did not start consultation with the mill earlier. There was a commitment to Pictou Landing First Nations some time ago. It's within a year, I know that. But I would have thought, knowing that the government had made that solid commitment to bring this piece of legislation in before the year end, that those discussions with the mill would take place. Because, I mean, it's my understanding that if the affluent treatment facility is to close, there needs to be another one in place. And I would assume that the mill would be required to build that, and would be required to ensure that the waste that they produce is treated in an appropriate facility. So that is concerning to me. And I listened and I spoke with Chief Paul and some of the other people who were in the audience that day who took the approach of being cautiously optimistic. And I think that's really where we stand today, is we are cautiously optimistic. As many have said in the past, this is something that needs to be dealt with, and I hope as we move forward and closer to the 2020 date that more details would be in place. For those who don't know, the agreement currently with the mill is to have the current affluent treatment facility open to 2030. So I applaud the fact that there'll be 10 years taking off that, but the minister indicated 5 years seems like a long time away, but I don't believe it's that far when you try to figure out how much work needs to be done between now and 2020 in 5 short years. So if that plant is closed, then a new plant needs to be up and running. It needs to have been tested and ensure that the safety and environmental rules are being followed. And that won't happen overnight. And I hope that there's time enough between now and then to make sure that that all happens. We have a history here in our province around sites like Boat Harbour, and of course talking about the Sydney tar ponds and the time that it had taken to clean that site up. And it's amazing to go down there today and see what's there now, and knowing what was there just a few short years ago. But that process took decades, Mr. Speaker. And even in here, with this closure of this of Boat Harbour affluent treatment facility, the current one, we won't see that remediation completed for approximately 9, maybe even 10 years down the road. The details still aren't known on exactly what approach or what type of remediation will take place there. And I know that has been a challenge, and that was a challenge in Sydney with the tar ponds. So, we are cautiously optimistic that this is going in the right direction. I think it's much more difficult in the future for any government that comes after the current government to back away from this, because if it's in legislation, it'll need another piece of legislation to come forward and wipe this out if a future government doesn't support this. So it is a positive thing to have it enshrined in legislation, and I want to thank the government for doing that. But as my colleague said, there's a lot of people in that community who are on different sides of the argument around what should happen, how fast, what it looks like. Don't kid you, we don't want to kid anybody, Mr. Speaker. The mill has been a strong economic driver for that region of the province for many, many years. And I don't think anybody wants to see the economy of that area just go away, and I would believe if the mill did close, that would happen. It would have a devastating effect to the area. I know the member who just spoke indicated some comments from the mill manager and the owner, who I think are genuine and committed to ensuring that they follow any environmental rules or changes that the government comes forward with. And I believe they want to do the right thing and hopefully move forward so that the cleanup of Boat Harbour can take place. So again, limited on details. I understand that negotiations have to happen. I would have hoped over the last 5-6 months that would have started by now, but we'll be keeping track of the minister and the government and the progress as we move forward. And I hope finally that we do see that day in 2020 that affluent treatment facility is closed and no longer doing the damage to the environment that we know that's going on right now. So we do look forward to this going through the process, going over the law amendments. I'm not sure if people will come forward and speak at law amendments, but we'll have to see. And we'll be here ensuring that the government lives up to their commitment and that they move forward in the appropriate way, and that's with consulting. I think a broad number of organizations and the community itself, but most importantly, I think with the mill, because they're going to be a key component to ensuring that the 2020 date is achievable. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Waverley Fall River, Beaverbank.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in favor of the new proposed legislation, Bill 89, Boat Harbour Act. This act will enable the elimination of the Boat Harbour treatment facility by the year January 31st, 2020. Before I go on too much further, I was not very happy with a lot of the comments made by our esteemed colleague from Pictou East. He seems to be very negative about anything that happens in the House here, and I think you need to be, your glass should be half full rather than half empty. And also the repetitiveness of his comments.
Order, please.
Yes.
The honourable member for Waverley Fall River, Beaverbank has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have many friends up in the Pictou area. I have visited.
I was going to say something else. Should have listened to what I said.
Order, please. Order, please. The honourable member for Waverley Fall River, Beaverbank has the floor.
I don't live there, but I do know the area very well. And I must admit, the last 2 summers going up there, the air emissions were not good at all. And as I drove by the mill, I would hold my air in my stomach and or my lungs till I got by, as much as I could at least. It was not a very nice aromatic smells coming from that mill's emissions. Anyway, Mr. Speaker, I want to be clear. The government is the first to establish legal commitment to residents of Pictou Landing First Nations and all of Nova Scotia to establish a timeline to eliminate all effluent to Boat Harbour. I think that in itself tells you what we're here to doing tonight that has not been done in the last 50 years by any other government. Boat Harbour has been assaulted since the beginning of the Abercrombie Mill in 1967, initially by allowing waste for a number of years to go directly into Boat Harbour without any treatment. In the early 70s, and I'm going to show you a connection that I have with this mill also. As I said, I have friends up there and neighbors. The Williams, Glenn and Jane, Jim and Alan Sinclair, the Dumonts, the Frasers, and one of the Fraser girls married a cousin of mine, so I do have some good knowledge of the area. And I'll go back now to in the early 70s, the outfall of the treatment plant was installed and went into Boat Harbor. After some treatment, I do recognize that the mill's importance in the economic driver for the jobs provided by the different mills that were in process of producing paper. Also, it's important to remember that environment should never be compromised. So we are going to set that straight. Boat Harbor is an inlet cove that was pristine, a tidal estuary that sits behind Pictou Landing First Nations and connects to the Northumberland Strait through a small channel next to the community. Pictou Landing First Nations welcomes this new legislation that has taken over 50 years to come to fruition. The bill will not be a broken promise. This bill will not be a broken promise. Coincidentally, and this is my other connection, Mr. Speaker, at a similar time in the 1970s, I began my work career as a chemist in the Federal Department of Fisheries Pollution Section, then soon to be officially a new department, Environment Canada, in 1972. As an inorganic chemist at BIO, Bedford Institute of Oceanography, my staff analyzed many thousands of water samples and sediment samples from Boat Harbor over my 25 years involved in a chemistry lab. Samples were collected by EC Environment Canada field staff, engineers, and technical staff. Samples were collected and analyzed for parameters that fall within Environment Canada's pulp and paper regulations under the Federal Fisheries Act. The Act says, under Section 51, the deposit of a deleterious substance in water frequented by fish is a violation of the Fisheries Act. And with that, charges can be laid and fines can be delivered. Mr. Speaker, tests include a simple test like biochemical oxygen demand. That's a test to indicate an idea of the toxicity of the water and the sample. Suspended solids, pH, are fairly straightforward. Dissolved oxygen readings are important to know what the inlet's oxygen ability is to be sustained, and nitrates and phosphate. In addition, I used this equipment, atomic absorption spectrophotometry and later plasma emission spectrophotometry to determine over 30 metals, including mercury, cadmium, lead, copper, zinc, which are some of the high levels of pollutants in that water. Also, the organic chemicals such as polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs, furans and dioxins, analysis under organic laboratory using ion chromatography. At the same time, biologists were conducting fish toxicity tests using trout and or salmon in 20-liter tanks of water from the mill. Samples of different percentages were tested to determine the concentration that 50% of the fish would live. From memory, over 37 years, the company regularly failed to meet all of the required standards set in the regulations. In addition, air contaminants were also determined. Madam Speaker, or Mr. Speaker, today that will all change, and I'm pleased to strongly support Bill 89. The planning of Boat Harbor remediation is well in progress. Over the years, over 30 reports have been produced that will provide information for the consulting engineers. Mr. Speaker, once we understand the best remedial technology option, we will then define the remediation plan that will be subjected to an environmental assessment. When we have the appropriate approvals in place and the effluent stops flowing into Boat Harbor, the remediation will be completed in 3 to 4 years. Mr. Speaker, this summer, there is a plan to collect samples and test the sediment samples from Boat Harbor, and will take place to help determine the remediation action and preparation plans. At this time, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased that Boat Harbor will be remediated back to a pristine condition to be an important recreational fishing site for all the communities once again. Madam Speaker, the Minister of Internal Services, Labby Kazoulis, stated recently.
Order, please.
Sorry.
I remind the honourable member for Waverly Fall River Beaverbank not to refer to other members of this assembly by their proper names. The honourable member for Waverly Fall River Beaverbank.
As said, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Internal Services stated recently, this government is committed to removing this environmental scar and make Boat Harbor a place for community can enjoy once again. Mr. Speaker, I thank you for the opportunity to speak on this bill. I think it's very important. I've spent in my community and colleagues at work when I worked with Environment Canada will be very pleased to see this issue solved and replaced by a proper treatment plant that will end the effluents going into the harbor. Thank you.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm absolutely thrilled to be able to be in this chamber and speak to this bill because I'll be honest, I was hoping that I would, within my 4 years until the next election, that I would have an opportunity to speak to such a piece of legislation. And I want to point out that it was almost a year ago this past June that probably ignited the reason for this piece of legislation. And I do want to commend the Minister of Environment for following through on a promise that was made after many, many discussions. You know, I will say that the other day when the bill was introduced, I literally wanted to jump up. You know, I was so excited with joy. And then I will say, I read the bill, and it was once again something, it was a little bit bittersweet because I was like, oh wow, I guess I was expecting pages and pages. So I'm still trying to wrap my head around why there's not more details. But before I go on, I just want to say that, you know, everything that my colleague from Pictou East stated, I absolutely concur with. My words will not be as eloquent as his or as detailed, but you know, I think we all know that we are absolutely in need of better environmental standards in Nova Scotia, and indeed this is a move in the right direction. The people of Pictou Landing First Nations, the residents of Pictou East, Pictou Centre, Pictou West have been waiting for a very, very long time for a commitment to clean up Boat Harbor. All governments have played a role in this. We're all to blame, and hopefully we'll all be a part of seeing this piece of legislation move forward and you know, be completed in 2020. You know, the interests of what has been happening, in fact, has the support and interest has been expanded way beyond the borders of Pictou County, beyond Nova Scotia, really. And you know, I I'm very, very pleased about this piece of legislation, but for me, it's been an ongoing emotional roller coaster, I guess, to say. You know, I grew up in Pictou County. I've always been hyper aware of the situation. I have been to the Boat Harbor Treatment Facility many, many times, long before. I mean, I think I remember being there actually as a teenager and on a school trip, actually, and having the process explained to me. And I can't help but feel, every time I go in there, I feel that it truly is this awful invasion on Mother Nature. My concern is that, was there any time given to enlist, to look for support from all the stakeholders involved? You know, we should always emphasize that joint efforts will benefit everyone's goal in this situation. And I often look at what we accomplish when we are at odds and when the odds are against us. But just think what we could be doing and what we could accomplish if we were collectively working together. And so goes with this piece of legislation. We knew almost a year ago that we wanted to put something of such forward. What I don't understand is, within this year, why isn't there more details around this bill? Maybe there is and we're just not being told, or there's files and files of information that's being prepared to see this piece of legislation come to fruition. You know, but something that my father always told me, he would remind me that the best teams are horizontal. And I agree with that. So, you know, I ask, like, why wasn't there more stakeholders involved in helping plan this piece of legislation? There should have been more discussions with absolutely Northern Pulp. I feel that after discussions with them, they certainly were shocked that there wasn't some type of dialogue with them. And, you know, there should have been more consultation with all stakeholders to gain their input. This decision to put a piece of legislation, once again, was almost a year ago. So I would think that it would have more details and more meat to it. I thought there would actually even be maybe a team put in place of how you're going to move this forward. And so, you know, these are things that raise concerns, not just for us, but it's certainly for the whole community, because I think they're feeling a little bit jaded with the situation, and there's still that uncertainty of trust. We have to get this right. You know, I know that the Minister of Environment especially knows my deep concern around this. He certainly has, anytime I had questions, he certainly communicated with me. A lot of people want, you know, as a politician, you often get, well, what side are you? Are you on this side or are you on that side? You know, I always believe that we should be able to coexist. But the right environmental standards have to be put in place, and they have to be followed. And, you know, I don't want to see the mill close. I have cousins and uncles that work there. In fact, my father's 71 and still works in affiliation with Canso Chemicals, which is part of Northern Pulp. And my grandfather actually worked there. However, he died at 62 with lead and mercury poisoning from, no doubt, as the doctor stated, from his work. So, you know, it's scary trying to find that balance of what's environmentally right and correct and effective, but still securing jobs. Because hands down, we need the jobs, we need work. You know, Pictou County just doesn't want to survive. Pictou County wants to thrive, and we have so much potential there. And I honestly believe if we can just work together and collectively get all the stakeholders involved, we can have a very positive outcome. You know, it's been a real emotional roller coaster, especially for the First Nations people and for all citizens, though. It's been most disheartening because time and time again, they've been told by all parties in this chamber. Oh, we're going to do something. We're going to fix that. And it just seems that years and years go by. So when we look at 2020, some people on the weekend were saying, oh my gosh, that's too far. That's way down the road. But ideally, I think in order to put a proper plan in place, it is going to take 5 years. And so I hope that we will be able to relay to the public, to our constituents, who's going to be involved in securing a detailed plan to ensure that in 2020 this is going to happen. You know, we talk about people that are negative or jaded or skeptical. Well, you know what, folks? We have a right to be. We have a right to be. There's always, you know, hope springs eternal, and that's what has happened here. And but people do get down. And when you're living right in that and you're steeped right in that environment, you can't help but feel that, you know, after 30, 40 years of nothing being done, what's changed? What has changed? So I'm always, you know, worried about something. And my friends say, oh, you're always worrying about this. You're always worrying about that. Well, you know, this weekend, I worried the whole time about this piece of legislation and what it actually means. You know, I stayed up late at night reading probably documents I probably didn't have to. I spoke to lawyer friends. I spoke to all people that I felt were stakeholders in this piece of legislation. And I was trying to collectively put their opinions and thoughts together. And at the end of the day, they all had different thoughts, but they also had the same concern in that they wanted to know, well, where's the details? So at least we're on the same page, many of us. We want to know where the details are. I was thinking how, you know, we don't need to go around creating false fears. We are surrounded day in, day out by genuine causes for concern. And my concern right now is this piece of legislation. I think that the concept is good. I support it. But I think it lacks details. And, you know, it is limited. I heard, you know, a member earlier saying that it's limited to details. I want to mention that I keep thinking about maybe I just don't get it. And that's why I spent all weekend, you know, showing people what do you think it means? I felt that it caused some confusion about this piece of legislation, and that was verified even when the minister had introduced it. There was a lot of questions he was asked by media that he could not answer. And even some lawyers failed to understand some of the content of this piece of legislation, the last 2 paragraphs. But you know, I think people fail to understand one another, even when they share the same opinion. And I guess this is the good part, that we all want Boat Harbour, though, to be cleaned up. We have all been calling on this, and now we have something that we can put into legislation and move forward. But let's think about how the bill can be strengthened. Let's think about what can we add to this bill to increase the confidence in our constituents, in Nova Scotians that are concerned about this piece of legislation and the lack of details in it. We all know that difficulties and issues are not solved without involving everyone, all those affected, and without understanding their perspectives. And that's why I think we need to open up more dialogue with more stakeholders. At the end of the day, people expect it more with this piece of legislation, and they deserve better, really. And we've waited a long time in Pictou County for this, and it is my hope, Mr. Speaker, that we can work collectively to ensure this bill comes to fruition, because it is the right thing to do. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I am pleased to rise to my feet tonight to respond to this bill, Bill number 89, the Boat Harbor Act. And I, too, am cautiously optimistic about the bill. I think it's about time that this issue was addressed. And I, too, am a little concerned that there's not more detail at this point in time. However, I think that knowing the area as I do, not as well, of course, as my colleagues to my right who live there and who have lived with this issue their entire lives, but I have many friends in the First Nation community, and as the new Aboriginal critic for Aboriginal Affairs, this issue is near and dear to my heart. I went down to Boat Harbor last summer when the broken pipe incident happened, and I have a friend who works in natural resources, and he took me through the whole area and showed me where the different problems have been. He showed me the effluent holding ponds, and he took me all along where the spill was coming out of the broken pipe and down to the beach and the dead birds and dead flora and trees that were in the area, and in fact the water, the toxic water leaching out into the ocean. So I've also been paying attention to the various people who are concerned in that community about what's been going on and pushing government to do something about the issue. And I know that they are also cautiously optimistic, but they are concerned. They have various concerns. And the other night, we were in budget estimates, and I was able to ask the Minister of Environment what the plans are with the Department of Environment about the toxins in the effluent, what they're going to be doing with it. And he did say several times that it's too early to tell, and that the Department of Internal Services would actually be in charge and taking the lead now on this file. So I wish that the Department of Environment was a little bit more involved. I think that this should fall under their auspices, because as my colleague mentioned from Pictou, the environment that we live in and its effect on the health and well-being of our people should be really one of the #1 concerns of our province. And the old tired tune of jobs versus the economy, I'm sorry, I don't buy that. I don't buy that argument. I think we can have both, and we just have to have strong rules and regulations in place to keep these businesses on the straight and narrow, so that they are following the proper rules that will ensure that our population and our environment and natural wildlife are protected. I'm pleased that the timing has been moved up, and that a new system will be in place sooner. I hope that the government does stick to that. And the other thing that I just want to talk about is that when I was in the area last summer and actually manned the barricade for some time, for a day, talking with the elders of the Pictou First Nations and hearing their stories of their memories of what it was like when they were children, when they could go to the beach and have picnics, when they could swim in the ocean, where they could go clamming, where they could eat of the beautiful bounty of Mother Earth and enjoy the gorgeous scenery. And it was a very popular spot where many different people came to visit and to stay and to swim and enjoy their family life. And that's all been taken away from them. And I did tour the beach where this all used to take place, and that the signs are there saying don't swim, don't dig clams, don't eat any of the seafood in the area. And I just have to say, you know, life is an ecosystem, And Pictou isn't very far away either. So if it's dangerous in that area to clam and eat the seafood, Pictou's not very far away. And so we need to be, I think, keep it in mind that everything is connected. And this is a tiny little province. So what affects one little area does affect other areas. And Nova Scotia is known for having more cancer, for instance, than many other jurisdictions. And you don't have to look far beyond the tar ponds in Sydney and Boat Harbour, I think, to understand why. And why, for so many years, was the smell of money more important than people's health? Because in my books, health is your greatest wealth. Without your health, you have nothing. And I would say that you ask any of the people in any of the communities where their health and well-being has been compromised and the health and well-being of their children is compromised, and I'll bet you anything that they'll say that that is worth more than gold. So with those few words, I will take my seat for tonight, and I commend the government for passing or introducing this bill. And we here on our side are cautiously optimistic. And with that, I'll take my seat. Thank you.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I must say I'm grateful to have the opportunity to say a few words about this particular legislation. And I'll try to be brief and to the point. Mr. Speaker, I think we all agree on one thing, that the status quo doesn't cut it. The status quo is not acceptable, and change is required. And I must say, must thank the Minister of Environment and the Minister of Internal Affairs for bringing this legislation forth on the floor. Mr. Speaker, experience is a wonderful thing, and when we're talking about issues in the House, if you're connected to the issue, it certainly means much more to you. For example, it could be a bridge somewhere that's in need of repair. It could be a health drug that some constituent needs. It could be a workers' compensation issue. Well, Mr. Speaker, my colleague from Pictou East that talked earlier, well, he lives in the community, Mr. Speaker. He's very familiar with the area, with the community, with the people outside the community, and with Boat Harbour. And again, Mr. Speaker, I will make a few comments a little later with regard to my experience living in Pictou County and living not too far from Boat Harbour myself. So, Mr. Speaker, we need a new state-of-the-art facility, treatment facility. It's critical that this process is correct. But where does it leave us? There's, once again, there's very little information on this bill, and perhaps that doesn't matter because the details and information will start to unfold as time goes on. Do we really have a plan that'll work? And it appears at the moment there's more questions than answers, Mr. Speaker, and we certainly cannot afford to mess this up. Mr. Speaker, I'm worried the fact that just 5 years seems such a short span of time. I mean, 5 years will come and go very, very quickly. And this is, I believe, a very massive undertaking. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to say let's walk slowly and do it right, but I'm not sure if the timeline is ever to do that. However, Mr. Speaker, back in late 2008, I was a member of a group that met with the First Nation community, Pictou Landing. At that particular time, I believe my colleague was here with me from Argyll Barrington and the former Cumberland South cabinet minister at the time. And Mr. Speaker, a commitment was made to this community to begin a process to close Boat Harbour and find another alternative for the affluent. Mr. Speaker, these plans sort of went south in early spring of 2009. However, Mr. Speaker, the discussion hovered around what had to happen to close the treatment plant, create a new facility, and protect jobs at the pulp and paper plant. Mr. Speaker, again, when I look at what's ahead of us, I do have concerns and questions, and I just hope the government did the proper consulting and planning required to do this job properly. This is a very emotional time for the First Nation community and, of course, the surrounding community in the area. As I mentioned earlier, Mr. Speaker, I'm very, very familiar with the Boat Harbour area and the community. Although it's not in my constituency, Mr. Speaker, I have a cottage not too far away, and throughout my career, I taught a lot of students from the First Nations community and the community surrounding the First Nations community. In fact, the present Chief Andrea Paul, worked with me at the Trenton Junior High School for a period of time. I believe, Mr. Speaker, that this will be one of the most important and serious files this government will deal with during their mandate. I believe the government must do a better job opening up the communication lines, especially with anyone that this affects, creating a dialogue with all the stakeholders where questions can be answered or issues and concerns are debated. Mr. Speaker, as it was mentioned before by several speakers, we certainly need more details, more information, and I believe the government can do a much better job with communicating with the stakeholders in this process and creating a positive relationship and one of cooperation and trust. It is critical that this legislation is handled very carefully, that all the questions are answered. The government's plan is to improve the area near the First Nation community, Mr. Speaker. They should already be involved in a plan to make sure this can and will happen. Again, 5 years is a short time to accomplish this job, closing the facility and opening a new one. I trust that immediately there will be talks with outside experts, engage all stakeholders, create a timeline that is achievable, inform the public on a regular basis as this process moves on, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think it's important and critical that we create an environmentally safe process, and this would also protect vital jobs that are so important in this industry in our province. Mr. Speaker, this project has to work, and the work has just begun. This project has to be manageable and achievable. And once again, Mr. Speaker, I'm looking forward to seeing the process as it unfolds, and I'm hoping, like all other members in the House, and especially in the community, that we can meet this timeline of 5 years, and it'll be a successful one, and both the community be safer as far as the environment is concerned, and the jobs will be protected. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is a great pleasure to be able to say a few words on this bill tonight, Mr. Speaker, and to follow the speakers from the Minister on to all of the members that have spoken to this point. I hope you don't mind, but I am particularly proud of the remarks of the three Pictou County members of the legislature, Pictou East, Pictou Centre, and Pictou West. They live with this more than anyone. They are strong voices for their constituents. As much as anyone in this chamber, Mr. Speaker, I believe they are determined to see that the time has come, that Boat Harbour is cleaned up, that the economy and the environment of Pictou County are protected, and that a real plan is in place, Mr. Speaker. And I do want to say that I know that it was the member for Pictou East who led off the opposition response tonight, and I thought he did a great job. And if I could summarize what he said, it seemed to me that he was saying that the time has come to address Boat Harbor, to clean it up, to protect the environment, to protect the economy, but he wants to see a real plan. I was so disappointed to hear the member for Waverly Fall River then say it sounded negative to him. Well, Mr. Speaker, only to a Liberal would asking for a plan sound negative, Mr. Speaker. And we've seen that in this House time after time, time after time. On the health administration, where is the plan? Never mind, we have a bill. It may or may not be constitutional, but we have a bill. Don't ask questions about the plan. On flavored tobacco, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable leader of the official opposition has the floor.
My point, Mr. Speaker, is that here we have a member on the opposition side saying, yes, let's get going on this goal, and that's what he gets, Mr. Speaker. So much for the quality of debate in this House, Mr. Speaker. That is my point. But I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that many people in this chamber, including the member for Waverly Fall River, apparently, have some connection to Pictou County, have some connection to the economy and the environment there, Mr. Speaker. I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, as I point out on occasion when I'm traveling through Pictou County, my dad's from the town of Pictou. I grew up in the summers in Pictou County. From my grandmother's house on Dunoon Street, you could see the mill, Mr. Speaker. You could smell the mill when the wind was blowing in the right direction. In fact, I heard the member from Truro spoke a few minutes ago. Well, as far away as Truro, Mr. Speaker, the presence of that mill was often in the evening air. Mr. Speaker, that was, of course, many years ago now. But you know what, Mr. Speaker? It's now 2015. And Nova Scotians have correctly come to a point where the status quo is not an option. And the people of Pictou County have been particularly clear that when it comes to Boat Harbor and the effluent and the emissions into the air, and this summer certainly made the point that the status quo is not an option, that the mill must do better, that the government must do better at regulating the mill and other large emitters. But most importantly, Mr. Speaker, when we look at this bill and we see hope to break the status quo, Mr. Speaker, and hope is important, we also have to avoid putting Nova Scotians in the position of feeling that they have to choose between their job and between the environment, because that is a false choice. That is not right. There is no need in 2015 AD to tell Nova Scotians you can have one or you can have the other. There are many other parts of this country, many other advanced countries in this world that are finding ways to have both decent jobs that pay a living wage, that allow families to grow and prosper at home, and to have a clean environment at the same time. That is the challenge of Pictou County. It is the challenge for the government of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. And we join in on that challenge as long as the government avoids the rhetoric around creating this false choice that you have to have one or the other, when clearly, Mr. Speaker, the residents of Pictou County have every right to decent employment and a clean environment. So, Mr. Speaker, I haven't heard a single person rise in this chamber yet on the government side or on the opposition side and say, you know what, let's keep things the way they are, particularly when it comes to Boat Harbor. Nobody wants to do that. The time has come to put in place a real, solid plan and clean it up. And, Mr. Speaker, I know there are some government members that are frustrated that in opposition want to see the plan. But you know what? It's not just the members on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, that behind us are thousands of residents of Pictou County, the Pictou Landing First Nations, the people that work at the mill, the people that work in our forest industry beyond the mill, Mr. Speaker, the people that own restaurants in downtown town of Pictou, Mr. Speaker, they also want to see the plan. And you know why, Mr. Speaker? Because they've heard all this before. Not even once or twice or 3 times, but they've heard these things before, Mr. Speaker. And sometimes it's in a platform, and sometimes it's a promise, and sometimes it's a letter, and sometimes it's in an election campaign. The fact that it has been put into a bill is positive, Mr. Speaker, but it's still a bill, and a bill that has a lot of unanswered questions. And that's why it's important that people know what the plan is this time above all. Mr. Speaker, it's not too much to ask. And that's what the Pictou County members are saying here tonight, among others. Mr. Speaker, I know that the Boat Harbour cleanup has been an outstanding issue for the province for many years. I can tell you from experience, Mr. Speaker, that in the early 2000s, beyond Boat Harbour even, was the Sydney tar ponds. Environmental mess that at that time was rated as the #1 environmental mess in all of North America, ahead of Boat Harbour. And Mr. Speaker, the government of that day spent several years and $400 million cleaning up the Sydney tar ponds, Mr. Speaker. That was a great experience, and that experience still exists in the government of Nova Scotia, and the contractors, and the regulators, and the environmental engineers that worked on that project to get us through that environmental disaster, Mr. Speaker. And all along, the thought was, once that is done, we can move on to Boat Harbour, Mr. Speaker. That has been the policy of the Progressive Conservative Party from that time in the cleanup of the Sydney tar ponds to this day, Mr. Speaker. So I know all parties, Liberal and NDP, and even PCs, can talk about what they've done or not done in the past to get to this point. I'll put my 2 cents in. The PCs in government under Premier Ham worked very hard to clean up the Sydney tar ponds, all along building that experience to then move on to Boat Harbour. And you know, Mr. Speaker, I suspect this will come up, but my predecessor in my seat, Murray Scott, was a minister at the end of the MacDonald government that put that in writing, that it was time to move on to Boat Harbour, and I'm awfully glad that he did. And I've been asked about his commitments since I was elected, and I've said absolutely, that remains a commitment of the Progressive Conservative Party, and it does to this day. That's why it's relatively easy to get up and speak to this bill, Mr. Speaker, following from the years of work cleaning up the tar ponds, onto the plan to clean up Boat Harbour. That government ended its term in office before it had a chance to act on that 2008 letter. The NDP were then in for almost 5 years, Mr. Speaker, and now here we are today, able to turn to the government, which has a bill about Boat Harbour, and say, we agree and like the idea of cleaning up Boat Harbour and completely agree that it's time to get on with the job. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, we know that the status quo is not an option, and that whether you're part of the Pictou Landing First Nations or a resident that lives in the area or someone who cares about the environment or someone that works at the mill, you want to know that this time a real plan will be put in place to really get the job done, Mr. Speaker, and we are here to work to strengthen that plan to make sure that people can see hope that this time this will lead to something very positive for Pictou County. Mr. Speaker, I mentioned the member for Pictou East a minute ago, but I don't want to let this moment go by without also talking about the commitment that the member for Pictou West has in this area. representing the other side of the harbor. Mr. Speaker, I hope she doesn't mind my sharing this, but I was with her in the town of Pictou on her first day as a politician, her first day as a nominated candidate for an upcoming election. And I remember going to the radio station, and she was going to be interviewed. And what we assume would be a relatively friendly interview, so you're a new politician, and why did you run, and what do you want to do? And it's great to see people stepping up. The very first question that the member for Pictou West was asked in her entire political career was, what are you going to do about Boat Harbour? And Mr. Speaker, I was so proud to watch her say, you know, the status quo is not an option. We need to clean up Boat Harbour. We have to find a way to make sure we preserve jobs and opportunity in the area while also having a clean environment. And that's what we need a plan to see, and I'll work towards that. And Mr. Speaker, having been in downtown town of Pictou with that member, talking to the shop owners, talking to the restaurant owners, talking to the people along the beautiful waterfront of the town of Pictou, who have been on the receiving end of those emissions last summer and for a lot longer than that, who worry about their businesses and their jobs and wonder if they count too. Mr. Speaker, a plan that gets this job done is also for them, and that's been the voice of the member for Pictou West. And of course, I can't leave out my colleague from Pictou Centre, who just spoke a moment ago on the same theme, Mr. Speaker, that Pictou County, a proud industrial part of our province, which has been built on natural resources, on manufacturing, on industrial activity, also has a chance now to take the lead on environmental cleanups. Now, how great an opportunity is that to match those two together, Mr. Speaker? And that is what our Pictou MLAs have been saying since they came to this House, Mr. Speaker, and that's what they're really saying to the Minister and the government in response to this bill, is this is something that I know we all have in common, that I know we all want to see done, that no one is going to stand in this House and say, let's leave things the way they are, but it's a delicate thing. It's been promised a lot in the past. It involves real people's jobs, which we want to protect, and it involves a cleanup of the environment, in particular, the situation at Boat Harbour, Mr. Speaker. So there's nothing wrong when you're faced with a bill, Mr. Speaker, of the magnitude of this one, that is really so thin on detail, with calling on the government to actually produce a plan of action that people can see for themselves, so they can decide for themselves whether this time something's really going to change or not, Mr. Speaker. And that plan has to include timelines. Now, we see the bill foresee the end of the treatment plant at Boat Harbour in 5 years' time, Mr. Speaker. And I hope that experts will be brought in, whether they are experts on the environmental approval process, federally and provincially, or on the options for treatment, or on the time it takes to truly divert the effluent to some other place, which is also, by the way, not defined, Mr. Speaker, so that we can judge for ourselves whether that timeline is realistic or not. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to think that when 2020 comes, that all of those things will be figured out, and that the mill will see a future for itself in a clean Boat Harbour, in a cleaned up Boat Harbour, in an environmentally friendly Pictou County with modern, clean treatment options, so that the people that work at the mill, that rely on those jobs and the forest jobs behind them, they'll also know where they fit into the equation, Mr. Speaker. Because when you bring a bill of one page in like this, without any thought to what the answer to those questions are, Mr. Speaker, that does leave people wondering, will my job still be there in 5 years? That's a valid question for the people that work in the mill or the surrounding forest industry, Mr. Speaker. For a shop owner, restaurant owner in downtown town of Pictou, will I really have an opportunity to expand out into the open air in my restaurant with clean air and happy customers after 2020? They have every right to know the answer to those questions, Mr. Speaker. If you own a campground or a bed and breakfast, Mr. Speaker, you have every right to know the answer to those questions before you are told to get too excited about this most recent promise, as the people are being told by the government, Mr. Speaker. These are very reasonable things that people are wondering. There are stakeholders, Mr. Speaker, with a very direct interest in seeing what the plan is beyond the skeleton of the bill, Mr. Speaker. The Pictou Landing First Nations were here the other day. They are cautiously optimistic. I understand completely what they're saying. It was a great privilege to be able to talk to them here at the legislature, Mr. Speaker. And you know, they have such dignity to come here and say, we're cautiously optimistic, but you know, we've been down this road before. And I think we all understand that, Mr. Speaker. And the best way to show the Chief Paul and the Pictou Landing First Nations that this is going to happen on the timelines indicated is to give them a chance to have a say in the planning and also a real plan, Mr. Speaker. That's only reasonable. The Forest Products Association, that represents literally the thousands of Nova Scotians who work in our forests, who harvest our forest stands, who work in sawmills that surround the pulp mill, whether they're in silviculture or in harvesting itself or in trucking, whether they produce chips or cut lumber, Mr. Speaker, whether they buy or sell from the pulp mill itself, they deserve to know what the plan is and where they fit into it, both now and even more importantly beyond 2020, Mr. Speaker. And so I hope the Minister and the government, they are listening not just to us, but to all of these people that are affected by these actions, Mr. Speaker, and I will include Northern Pulp itself, who I believe was not consulted on the bill at all until the afternoon before. Well, you know, Mr. Speaker, they employ several hundred of our fellow Nova Scotians. And yes, they certainly have to change their practices around emissions, around effluent into Boat Harbour. But we can't leave them out of the process. That's not right either, Mr. Speaker. They have to make decisions. I hope that we have a plan and a framework that allows the owners of Northern Pulp to decide that they want to work and invest and employ people in our province consistent with strong environmental regulations, with a cleaned up Boat Harbour, and with tight controls over emissions. A lot of that's being debated right now in their appeal of the industrial approval, Mr. Speaker. But surely, if we want employers like Northern Pulp to change and get with the program around jobs and a clean environment, they got to know what the world is going to look like in Nova Scotia beyond the next 5 years. After all, the investments that we would be asking them to make are in the tens of millions of dollars and are for the long run, Mr. Speaker. That actually brings me to a point, Mr. Speaker, that I do want to make about the right way to go about this. And that is to make sure that we have a thorough understanding of both the environmental impact of this bill and the economic impact of the bill. That as the government moves forward, Mr. Speaker, that it be ever mindful of the fact that the decisions that get made around Boat Harbour, around the appeal of the industrial approval, around our great environmental goals about emissions and other things, they always have to take into account the ongoing need to responsibly develop our natural resources and create jobs and opportunity for Nova Scotia families, particularly in rural areas. That this is a great balancing act. That the great opportunity for rural Nova Scotia, including Pictou County, is to be able to responsibly harvest our forests, responsibly mine our underground resources, responsibly develop our offshore resources in a sustainable way, using modern techniques, using best-in-world practices to protect the environment and to capture the economic value of those jobs. Mr. Speaker, that is really the challenge before us all. And Mr. Speaker, this bill doesn't really talk about the economic impact of what is about to happen. But it is important that that also be done properly. So, Mr. Speaker, yes, we're standing here saying this is a bill we can get behind, but it leaves a lot of unanswered questions. And there are many unanswered questions about the environmental impacts of the bill and whether the feasibility of getting this done in the timeline that the bill foresees. We hope that it can be done, and it's with hope that we ask to see the plan. But everything that I just said about the environment is also true about the economic impact. That there are lots of unanswered questions about what this means for the future of employment in our resource industries, in harvesting and in pulping in Pictou County, Mr. Speaker. And we need to see what the plan is there as well, just as much as the workers do, both in the mill and in the forests themselves, Mr. Speaker. And the bill leaves a lot of unanswered questions for them. And I think it's important that those questions be answered in a very timely way, including, by the way, involving all of the stakeholders that I've just mentioned and the expertise that can be brought to bear. Mr. Speaker, this is not unlike what happened with the Sydney tar ponds a decade ago, or a little more than a decade ago. There were great environmental concerns about the cleanup. They were brought to the table. There were great concerns about the impact on Cape Breton Island, Mr. Speaker. They were brought to the table. There were even concerns about what this would mean for the ability to attract and retain jobs in the Sydney area. That was brought to the table. And Mr. Speaker, I wish all that could be done overnight, but we know from experience from the Sydney tar ponds it can't. I am hopeful that it can be done in the 5 years that the bill mandates, but we need to see a plan to make sure that that's true. Mr. Speaker, I heard a government member, I think it was a government member, mention the Environmental Goals and Sustainable Prosperity Act of 2007. That important landmark piece of environmental legislation, Mr. Speaker, was passed with all-party agreement in this House. And the great goals that it set on renewable energy targets, on emissions targets, Mr. Speaker, have made Nova Scotia among the forefront of provinces and states in North America for actually enshrining in law important environmental goals. And as far as I know, having had 2 other parties form governments since it was passed, it continues to have all-party support, Mr. Speaker. And I want to remind the government that it is the Environmental Goals and Sustainable Prosperity Act, because it also included important economic goals. The biggest one being that we would strive to grow the economy of Nova Scotia at the national average or better each year. Mr. Speaker, let's not lose sight of that in our rush on these things, Mr. Speaker. That bill was set to balance the need for both. In fact, the numbers in that bill, they weren't picked out of the air. The environmental goals and the economy goals, they were actually set to complement each other. That's why you don't need to choose one or the other. We have this great act. It's the law of the province that says we want to meet these environmental goals and we want to grow the economy at the national rate or better each year. And they fit together. They complement each other. Why not do the same thing here with Boat Harbor? Why not generate the detailed plan that shows people that they can have meaningful employment and that we can have a cleaned up Boat Harbor and a modern and much cleaner effluent treatment option at the same time, Mr. Speaker? That's really where we are, Mr. Speaker. So I'm glad there's a bill we can get behind, and I'm suspecting with all party support. That's a good thing, Mr. Speaker, but we can't be a party to another attempt to clean up Boat Harbor that falls apart in the details. So, Mr. Speaker, through you to all members of the House, I don't doubt that we all share the same desire to protect the pristine nature of our beautiful province, to clean up legacy environmental messes where we see them. We have some success in that area over the past decade and a half. I don't even disagree that Boat Harbor is the next one that we should focus on, Mr. Speaker. That's absolutely where we should put our resources now. But to make it true, to make it real, Mr. Speaker, it takes more than a vote of the legislature. It takes a real plan. The bill is short on those details, but we're quite prepared to work together to get to that point, Mr. Speaker, where the details are there and the people of Pictou County, the people that rely on the resource for jobs, the people that want to see a cleaned up Boat Harbor, they can all know that together something real is going to happen by 2020, Mr. Speaker, and what the work environment and the living environment will look like at that time. So, Mr. Speaker, in the spirit of the All-Party Environmental Goals and Sustainable Prosperity Act, we look forward to the continued debate on this bill here and in law amendments and then throughout the rest of the process. Thank you very much.
If I'm to recognize the Honourable Minister of Internal Services, it will be to close debate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just for some clarification on the House, but before I get there, I would like to thank the members from Pictou East and West. They've been strong advocates for boat harbors and for their community. And Mr. Speaker, I think regardless of rhetoric that happens in here, I think it's safe to assume that every member in this House wants to see the cleanup of Boat Harbor. It's not only a black eye for the community of Pictou, it's a black eye for all of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, we, a couple of things that were said, and I'd like to add clarification for the House. The member from Truro Bible Hill was alluding to that it'd be great for the Department of Environment to oversee the cleanup of Boat Harbor, and what I'd like to add for clarification is that the Department of Internal Services will perform the cleanup of Boat Harbor, but Department of Environment, they're a regulatory body. They will oversee our department to make sure it gets done in the proper manner. Mr. Speaker, the other parts I would like to add is just for a little bit of clarification as to what is happening over the next 5 years. We have been testing in Boat Harbor. This province has been testing for quite a while. There have been over 30 Phase 2 environmentals done. There's been a lot of work done on Boat Harbor over many years, and we have still been testing recently, and we are looking at the particulate matter to know how to deal with it. Over the next 5 years, what we will be doing is we will actually be pinching off an inlet, and by pinching off an inlet, we know that on the coast, on the outside parts of Boat Harbor Lake is where the strongest concentration of the matter is that we need to remediate and clean up. When we pinch off an inlet, what we'll be able to do is actually do a cleanup, and from what we learn in knowledge as to what is there and how we're going to clean it up, then we will apply that knowledge to the remediation of all of Boat Harbor. Mr. Speaker, there's been a lot of talk saying that there were no negotiations done. There was lots of negotiations done, and it was with the members of Pictou Landing First Nation who we made a commitment to. In regards to this legislation, we could talk about adding more to the bill and making the bill longer and putting in a time frame and deliverables. What my fear if we do that, Mr. Speaker, is that if we start putting goals A, B, and C, if any of those are not met, then we don't get to the ultimate goal, which we all want, which is to stop the flow of effluent into Boat Harbor. I am not sure how a bill could be more precise than to say, by January 2020, we will stop the effluent flowing into Boat Harbour, Mr. Speaker. And that is the commitment we made. And we have 5 years to plan to do a full remediation, and in that period, we will do a partial remediation of Boat Harbour. We will know what we're dealing with, and on January 2020, we will stop the flow of effluent into Boat Harbour. Mr. Speaker, it was mentioned that this is nothing more than a piece of paper, and I find that very disturbing, because it's not a piece of paper. This is legislation, and we're in here debating about legislation. And once this legislation passes, it's not a piece of paper. It is passed as an act. And if we want to ever change having the flow of effluent go into Boat Harbour, we're going to have to all come back in here, or whoever is here in a day, and actually pass new legislation to have that happen. And that is more powerful than any discussions or any words or anything written in the past has ever been done on Boat Harbour. Mr. Speaker, I had a chance to live in the Pictou area. I had the opportunity to live there back in 2005. I was the controller of Trenton Works. I was there on a contract. And it's a wonderful area, beautiful part of Nova Scotia. I very much enjoyed my time there. I got to meet many people in the community there, and even then people would talk about not only Boat Harbour, not only the mill, but even Nova Scotia Power Plant, which every day covered my car in soot. That's a whole other issue, but I have an understanding of what the community goes through, and the community is not alone. All Nova Scotians, just like Sydney Tar Ponds, want to see the cleanup of Boat Harbour. I will close on this aspect, Mr. Speaker. In order to gauge the seriousness of how we look at Boat Harbour, I asked people to go and look at our estimates this year, which is where we allocated money. There was $20 million allocated to the cleanup of Boat Harbour, and all of our testing we've been doing over the last year in consultation with the Pictou First Landing has shown that $20 million is not going to be enough to remediate the site. We actually booked the liability of a further $30 million, and we have $50 million aside for the cleanup of Boat Harbour. Mr. Speaker, I'm confident that all of the actions our government is taking will give Nova Scotians ease that there will be a remediation done. The effluent will stop flowing into Boat Harbour. And Mr. Speaker, if I'm not in my seat in 2020, I can tell you one thing. If the effluent is still flowing into Boat Harbour, I'll go and be part of that blockade down there as myself. Mr. Speaker, with those few words, I would like to close debate on Bill 89. Thank you.
The motion is for second reading of Bill 89, the Boat Harbour Act. Would all those in favor of the motion please say aye. Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried.
Bill number 89, an act respecting the cessation of the use of the Boat Harbour Effluent Treatment Facility for the reception and treatment of effluent from the Northern Pulp Mill.
Order that the bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Speaker, that concludes the government's business for today. We shall meet again tomorrow on Wednesday, April 22nd from the hours of 1 p.m. to 11:59 p.m. During the day from 1 p.m. till 5:30 p.m. will be Opposition Day, for which I'll ask the House Leader and Official Opposition to give us business. Following Opposition Day tomorrow, we will resume to government business, where the House will resolve into Committee on Estimates to continue the debate on estimates for 4 hours. A determination of that will terminate the government's business for today. So, Mr. Speaker, with that, I'll now ask the House Leader Official Opposition to give us business during the Opposition business tomorrow.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. After the daily routine, of course, we'll be calling, in question period, we'll be calling Bill 93, the Executive Council Act, and Bill 96, the Revenue Act. After that debate, of course, we'll be having a late debate as well. I now move that you rise, and we'll meet again between the hours of 1 and, I guess, 11:59.
The motion is to adjourn until tomorrow, April 22nd, between the hours of 1 p.m. and 11:59 p.m. Would all those in favor of the motion please say aye. Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. Motion is carried. We now stand adjourned until 1 p.m. tomorrow.